Queen Victoria, or to be precise, Her Majesty Victoria, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Queen, Defender of the Faith, Empress of India. She was the overseer of Britain's golden age, an expanding empire, the most rapid industrialisation known to man, unprecedented technological advancement, and the founding of the modern world.
The classic impression of Victoria is this woman that's removed slightly from the empire that she presides over, but actually she was a very passionate woman. She was witty, she was intelligent, she was a curious person, she was interested in people.
Queen Victoria was very much a young woman of her age. She enjoyed herself. She went to balls and dances and she flirted with men. She wanted to do what her passions dictated.
She was a drug taker. She would take laudanum. She was partial to a bit of cocaine, chewing gum and marijuana, and she enjoyed being queen.
We all grew up knowing the old Victoria a lot better, you know, this stout Germanic woman with her white veil and little crown and oyster eyes and big tummy. But there's a completely different Victoria who's vivacious, who's flirtatious, who likes to party, who likes to have affairs, completely the polar opposite of what we were led to believe Queen Victoria was.
In this episode, we explore the young Victoria and her racy medicine cabinet, the special sex chair her delinquent son and future King of England, Edward VII, had made, and we also uncover the fascination Victoria had with all things Indian, including curry. But behind the grand titles, who was the real Victoria? Was Prince Albert really her only love? Or was her relationship with a young Indian servant more spicy than the curries he cooked for her? Was she really the straight-laced prude who defined the Victorian age? Or will a look behind closed doors reveal a seedier, darker side of the era, one that involved lots of drink and drugs? I'm Tracy Borman, and this is the private life of Queen Victoria. The future Queen Victoria was born here at Kensington Palace in London on the 24th of May, 1819. She was brought up and schooled by her mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and by all accounts, it was a largely happy childhood. But her position as heir to the throne meant that many in her immediate circle saw her as a ticket to power. She put her overbearing mother in this category.
As a young heir to the throne, she did lead a very closeted life, and she was kept cocooned in Kensington Palace by her mother and her mother's close friend. So this frustrated this passionate young woman. She was witty, she was intelligent, she was a curious person, she was interested in people.
The very young Victoria, the girl, she's brought up in Kensington Palace in a deliberately restricted system, the Kensington system it was called, by her mother and her mother's advisor, John Conroy, and they were doing it deliberately to control her.
Victoria's mother instructed her to begin keeping a diary. In reality, this was a method of control. Victoria wrote down her thoughts, and this meant that her mother could read them. It was a ritual she would stick to for the rest of her life, writing an average of 2,500 words per day. Victoria's early diary entries were not yet the repository of sorrows they would become. For example, on her birthday in 1833, she wrote, "Today is my birthday. I am today 14. How very old. I awoke at 5:30 and got up at 7:30. I received from Mama a lovely hyacinth brooch and a china pen tray. From Uncle Leopold, a very kind letter, also one from Aunt Louisa and Sister Fedora. She goes on to talk about the ball held in her honour. I danced first with my cousin George Cambridge, then with Prince George Leven, then with Lord Brooke, then Lord March, then Lord Athlone, then with Lord Fitzroy Lennox, then with Lord Emlyn. We then went to supper.
She enjoyed herself. She went to balls and dances and she flirted with men. And most importantly, she was absolutely desperate to break free from her mother's control. And so she had this rebellious spirit, this rebellious streak in her. She wanted to do what her passions dictated, probably because her mother had been reining her in so tightly for so many years.
On the 20th of June, 1837, Victoria became Queen, aged just 18. Suddenly she had power and could do as she pleased. She fell in love with and married her cousin Albert and dismissed her domineering mother from Buckingham Palace.
She did enjoy spending time with men and she did flirt. She was a little bit promiscuous, or cheeky at the very least. This changed when she met and fell in love with, head over heels in a way, with Prince Albert.
She met him once, and that was fine in 1836, and then she meets him again in 1839, and it's suddenly like, wow, it sticks this time. And she just, basically, she writes in her diary, he's beautiful, you know, he has beautiful blue eyes, and he has a beautiful nose. She could think of nobody else other than Albert. That was it. Albert was the one for her, and she asked him to marry her.
This is surprising in some ways because he was quite a reticent figure. He wasn't particularly charming or loving. He was this sort of hard-headed, no-nonsense German. Perhaps that was part of the appeal. But certainly he seemed to be a stabilizing influence upon her, and she derived a certain kind of security from him as well. She derived strength to rule what was not just a country, but an entire empire that kind of spread across the entire globe.
Victoria dedicated herself to her role as Queen and had a genuine concern for the welfare of her subjects. She came into contact with a young Winston Churchill, who she liked, and it was said that the pair would chew gum together. But this chewing gum had a difference. It was laced with cocaine. And this wasn't the only drug she was partial to. Dr. Rosemary Leonard is an expert on Victorian medicine and has agreed to meet me in an old Georgian house in Soho in London and show me some of the paraphernalia that would have been used by Queen Victoria. So, Rosemary, we have a delight of medical paraphernalia here. Can you talk us through it?
Well, in the 19th century, most people smoked opium. And this is a wonderful contraption, which is like a Victorian hookah pipe. So you would have your pellet of opium in the top there. You put water in there. Then you lit here. And then...
Oh, it would turn into beautiful fumes.
Which you would then get your morphine opium hit.
And would Victoria herself have been sat there puffing on this amazing opium pipe?
No, she didn't like smoking. So she took her opium as a tincture, more delicate. The tincture, however, the opium was dissolved in 90% alcohol.
Oh, gosh. OK, so very potent mixture then.
Very potent mixture. So she wakes, she's got period pains, she's got a headache. First thing in the morning, she has a swig of her laudanum tincture, which gives her not only her hit of opium, but also, you know, gives her a hit of alcohol first thing in the morning.
Wow, so she would actually be probably quite drunk at the beginning of the day if she needed to take this.
Yes, and of course, like morphine today, laudanum, opium, highly addictive stuff.
Queen Victoria seems to have had a rather racy medicine cabinet. I mean, there was opium, there was laudanum, which is a mixture of opium and alcohol, which people believe could cure anything. She took chloroform during childbirth, which she said was hugely enjoyable. And she's even supposed to have written an anonymous review for a newspaper for a product called Van Mariani, which was a mixture of cocaine and alcohol. So Queen Victoria, I think by any standards, she loved her drugs.
In the Victorian era, they were moving on to anaesthesia. The drug that was used was chloroform, good old chloroform. It could be given via a mask. Just feel the weight of...
Oh, it's a lot heavier than I was expecting. Wow, and so this end, obviously, is where you breathe in.
Yes, that's the mask end, and then it would be coming in via a pipe.
Oh, yes.
The gas.
Oh, wow. And so would Victoria have taken this?
No, she did hers in a more delicate way. She had her chloroform for the birth of her last 2 children. So she would have her chloroform dropped on her handkerchief there, which she gently placed over her nose and breathed in the vapours.
I'll just have a very delicate smell of this. Yes, even from here, you can smell it's very strong. But what did Victoria herself think to this new drug?
She wrote in her diary that this wonderful drug was soothing, quieting and delightful beyond measure.
Well, the young Victoria was a drug taker. She would take laudanum. She was partial to a bit of cocaine, chewing gum and marijuana and all the rest of it. And she enjoyed being queen. She wasn't this kind of detached figure that we have a mental picture of later on in her reign. So in that sense, the secret Victoria, if you like, is as important as the later, more restrained one.
The young queen did enjoy life a little too much. But the reality was that these were turbulent times, and threats to not just the monarchy, but world leaders were very real. Being head of state in the 19th century was a very dangerous occupation. During Victoria's lifetime, assassination attempts were made on nearly every major European ruler and head of state, including the high-profile murder of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, while across the pond, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head at point-blank range. This surge in political murder meant security was top priority for a woman who lived her life staring down the barrel of a gun. On the first attempt on her life, in June 1840, Victoria wrote, "As we had just left the palace, about halfway up the road, I was deafened by the loud report of a pistol, and our carriage involuntarily stopped. We looked round and saw a little man on the footpath, with his arms folded over his breast, a pistol in each hand. And before half a minute elapsed, I saw him aim at me with another pistol. I ducked my head, and another shot, equally loud, instantly followed."
Victoria's reign went through a striking number of phases. In the very early days, she wasn't popular. The public wanted to know what she was doing with her money, who she was, why she was marrying Albert. There were many things people weren't happy with, and the politics was very turbulent. And this gave rise to hostility, and there were 7 assassination attempts on her life, all of which she survived.
Few people know more about royal security than Di Davis, a retired chief superintendent of the Metropolitan Police and former head of the elite Royal Protection Squad, whose job it is to guard the royal family today. So, Di, there were quite a few assassination attempts on Victoria, weren't
Well,
there?
there were indeed at least 7 to my knowledge, but of course she was stalked by many, many more. In that first year, when she came to the throne as a young 18-year-old, there were, to my knowledge, at least 30 different kind of incidents, stalking we call it now.
Really?
But men were obsessed with her looks. They were obsessed with the young queen after all those Hanoverians that came to the throne who weren't really liked. So this was a fresh start when she was 18.
Now, can you talk us through, obviously you're an expert in royal security. What were the security measures like in Victoria's day?
Well, frankly, they were pretty poor. And that's evidenced by the fact that Edward Jones, Boy Jones, or In We Go Jones, who's 14, actually got into Buckingham Palace at least 3 times, but
Really?
in truth, he got in about a dozen times at least. And of course, he was caught first time in 1838. Victoria wasn't there that time, and on December the 3rd, he was caught by the night watchman, and he was covered in grease. He had stolen some items from the master of the household, and it's alleged her knickers.
Oh, really?
Now, whether that's true or not, but he wasn't charged with that. And you know, up until very recently, it wasn't an offence to go into royal premises. So Boy Jones eventually came back and he did it again. This time he got 3 months hard labour.
Edward Jones is one of the big tabloid stories of Queen Victoria's reign. He gets into Buckingham Palace and he's caught basically stealing Queen Victoria's underwear and a regimental sword. He's then sent to prison, and then the moment he gets out, he's back in again. And he's found actually underneath a sofa, skulking, and then he's sent to prison again, and then he makes his way back, and this kept going on and on.
Edward Jones was this very peculiar character who managed to repeatedly break into Buckingham Palace and tried on the crown, sat on the throne, slept in a servant's bed, hid under the sofa, even it's said that read some of Victoria's private correspondence. He was obsessed with this. He was obsessed with her, with this secret life behind palace doors. And the only way they could get rid of him was actually to send him off to deport him to Australia.
So, Di, with all of these various attempts on Victoria's life, was she ever actually harmed?
Yes, she was. The worst was by a chap called Robert Patay in Piccadilly, where he managed to hit her, get close to her, and hit her 3 times on the head with a silver cane. It caused huge bruising, concussion, and yet she went to the theatre that night, which shows the character of the woman.
What a woman, indeed. In November 1840, the royal couple's first child, Victoria, was born here in Buckingham Palace. Despite the fact that the Queen would go on to have 9 children, she absolutely hated being pregnant and wasn't much of a fan of the result either. Where kids were concerned, Victoria just wasn't the maternal kind.
Victoria and Albert had a very lively sex life, it has to be said. They were extremely close in terms of their personalities. She was sometimes irritated by him trying to exercise political power, but they were extremely close, and I think she was very happy.
She really looked up to him for all sorts of guidance, and he was her partner every step of the way. And they were very sexually compatible as well. They really liked sex, and she really liked sex. But what she didn't like was the pregnancies that resulted from the sex. And she didn't like raising babies into children. She didn't like those very traditional feminine things. But she really enjoyed the intimacy with Albert.
In November 1841, Victoria's second child, Albert, known as Bertie, was born. Bertie would grow up in a very different mould to his parents. He was a playboy who arguably took after his great-uncle, George IV.
He was a party animal and a member of the so-called Marlborough House set, named after his London residence. He found pleasure in the conquest of aristocratic women, and this led the group to indulge in a bit of wife-swapping. But in 1890, he took it even further, commissioning a piece of furniture to make it easier for him to enjoy the company, shall we say, of several women at the same time.
Bertie seems to become quite a louche figure. He fell in love with Paris. He loved the whole vibe of the city, and I think that kind of then infected the way he approached sex, approached relationships. You know, he had these very decadent affairs with actresses.
Bertie became everything that Victoria hated. He loved women, loved sex, was outrageous in his lifestyle. He lived a lavish lifestyle. He ate, he partied, he did everything he wasn't supposed to do.
Jane Ridley is a historian and author who knows all about Bertie's wild behaviour and has agreed to show me a quite remarkable item from his life.
Oh, my word. Well, this looks like quite an extraordinary contraption. Now, the mind is already boggling over exactly how this was used. So this is a replica?
Yes. This was a replica. The original is in Paris.
Oh, we still have the original. That's interesting. And it was made especially for Bertie?
It was made especially for Bertie, and it was kept at this very grand Paris brothel called Le Chabanais.
Wow. Well, I am going to have to, I think, stand in Bertie's footsteps because clearly, however else it works, this is where he stood. We have two sort of gold imprints for his feet, one there and the other there. Now, am I about the same height as Bertie?
Well, how tall are you?
I'm 5'11".
All right, well, he was 5'8".
OK.
And very much considerably stouter.
Right, indeed. Is this why the chair was built? Because of his girth to
yes.
sort of help him?
Well, that's what I've read, yes, that it made things easier for him.
So he'd have stood here, the lady would have been in whatever position here. I mean, these look a bit like stirrups, don't they?
They look horribly gynecological.
They do, rather. And then these are for Bertie
I don't envy that lady.
Hold on to, no, indeed. And then, so one lady there. And what's going on underneath? Because it's still quite plush, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's still very upholstered, and I think that there was probably another woman underneath.
The mind boggles, really.
The sex chair that Bertie used is really quite an extraordinary contraption, and it's upholstered and it has arms, and it really takes a lot of imagination to try to figure out exactly where everybody would be going and at what time, and bearing in mind that he was very heavy at this point in his life.
Clearly, the intention was that a woman would lie on the lower one, a woman would lie on the higher one with her feet in the stirrups, and then basically Edward could alternate between the two women as he saw fit.
Do we know anything about the ladies with whom he conversed on this chair?
We don't know exactly who was on this chair. I mean, but we know that they would have been the grandest and most glamorous of Parisian courtesans.
Wow, so he was quite selective in the ladies he chose. Well, I think that's enough of me reenacting Bertie's movements. And I'm just interested because he is such a bon viveur, isn't he? He's enjoying himself. It's not just for show.
Well, I think there's an element of sort of masculinity, of displaying your prowess as a lover with this kind of thing. It's all quite public. It's not furtive, it's not hidden. But he does enjoy it. There's absolutely no question about that, certainly.
Does his mother know what he's doing?
I'm sure she would have been deeply shocked if she'd seen this thing, Queen Victoria.
In December 1861, Victoria's beloved husband Albert died. Victoria went into a period of mourning for many years, and she was to wear black for the rest of her life. She commissioned this incredible memorial to the love of her life at a cost of £10 million in today's money.
I think it's impossible to underestimate how big an effect the death of Prince Albert had on Queen Victoria. She was there at the moment of his death, and she held his hand. And for the rest of her life, she had a plaster cast of his hand in her bed, which seems rather morbid. And she said in a letter to her daughter, Vicky, "I can't live without him. I want to be pressed against him and feel his heart beating."
Monarchs are people like anybody else, and they have feelings, and part of their job is to restrain those feelings and to be a leader, a ruler. But Victoria didn't care about that in her grief, and she sought solace, and she sought company, and she sought to be who she was.
It's clear how much the death of Albert affected her by the fact that she didn't write in her diary from the day of his death until the new year of 1862, when she wrote this emotional entry. Have been unable to write my journal since the day my beloved one left us, and with what a heavy, broken heart I enter on a new year without him. My dreadful and overwhelming calamity gives me so much to do that I must henceforth merely keep notes of my sad and solitary life.
Victoria was completely devastated by Albert's death. It was something she never recovered from. She totally retreated from society. She wouldn't engage in any state functions. She wouldn't meet ambassadors.
She starts to transform into the Victoria that we know. She dresses in black for the rest of her life. She retreats completely from public life to the point where, in fact, she goes off to Balmoral. She just gets out of London and she is not seen. She's an invisible figure. And when she is seen again, she has become what we know as Queen Victoria.
With Albert dead, Victoria spent an increasing amount of time away from London, in Scotland. And it was here that she became close, it said, to her gillie and personal servant, John Brown.
It wasn't quite as simple as queen servants. We recently have discovered from letters that have been unearthed that she would sign her letters on occasion Mrs. Brown rather than Queen Victoria. So it seems as though there was a certain kind of parity, and on some level they thought that they were equals. And I suppose that shows that the youthful spark that had been so much in evidence before the death of Albert hadn't quite been extinguished.
Who knows whether she was in love or whether it was just nice to have a companion, but she finds a deep connection with a servant, and it started through him helping her out, perhaps into her carriage, and then it grew into something more profound as time progressed.
The rumour mill went into overdrive, and stories soon started circulating that there was something more to their relationship. Republican journals began to spread the idea that they had secretly married, and even within the royal family, Brown was jokingly known as Mama's lover.
It was an incredibly unorthodox relationship because of, obviously, the disparity in rank. And he was this very lowly servant, and here was the Queen of England. She was very, very vulnerable at this time. This was a real desperate attempt to find solace in the company of another man.
We will never know the details of the relationship between Victoria and Mr. Brown, but it's absolutely clear that he was incredibly important to her. Royal historians, being royal historians, say that it was all very proper and this was a relationship with a servant, but one only has to look at her letters for the tenderness that comes through. One only has to read other people's accounts and diaries of the way they behave together. So there's absolutely no doubt that this was an intrinsically important relationship in her life.
Together for over 30 years, the question as to whether Victoria's relationship with Brown was a sexual one will always continue to divide historians. In a letter to Brown, Victoria wrote, characteristically in the third person, "Perhaps never in history was there so strong and true an attachment, so warm and loving a friendship between the sovereign and servant. Strength of character as well as power of frame, the most fearless uprightness, kindness, sense of justice, honesty, independence and unselfishness, combined with a tender, warm heart, made him one of the most remarkable men." John Brown died in 1883, and the Queen commissioned a statue in his memory.
After the death of John Brown, she shuts down mentally, physically, psychologically, and it seems that to cope with this emotional blow, she turns to food, almost like as a comfort, and she begins like eating ravenously, much more than before, and in time she finds herself much wider than she is tall. She was only 4'9", and this seems to be a direct consequence of that second heartbreak with John Brown.
One of the things that is the main part of being a monarch is this loneliness. It's a role that you carry yourself. So she is the constant throughout her life. People come and go, loves come and go, and it may be absolutely devastating for her, but she continues, she fights on, she lives to see another day.
In 1887, the year of the Golden Jubilee, 24-year-old Abdul Karim was one of 2 boys selected to become servants to the Queen from the newly British-controlled India. The Queen took to him almost immediately, and he rapidly became her closest confidant, filling the shoes of John Brown.
There's a huge age gap between these two. They form a very close bond, and she begins to become infatuated with sort of Indian foods and kind of Indian fashions and just the Indian way of life. So all of a sudden, the kind of prim and proper British food is sort of cleared away, and she doesn't mind ordering her sort of white courtiers out of the room, while she kind of forms this ever closer bond with Abdul Karim. And it seems as though she's regaining something of that lust for life that was so evident in the pre-Albert days. She wants to embrace the unknown and try new things.
It's a very intimate association. It's almost a mother and son relationship, and they share so much, and yet they have nothing outwardly in common at all. She's very absorbed in this relationship, which gives her solace, which gives her comfort, and something that she can connect with. Being a monarch is very lonely. And what she was searching for towards the end of her life was a deep, meaningful connection with somebody that wasn't a minister, somebody who didn't have an ulterior motive. And here he was.
Soon, Karim became far more to Victoria than a mere servant. He began to teach her Urdu, and the pair became inseparable. He was promoted and barely left her side. And one day, a new and exciting smell began to fill Windsor Castle. Curry. Mark Meltonville is an expert on Victorian cuisine and has agreed to rustle up a curry that her servant, Abdul Karim, actually made for the Queen. OK, Mark, what do we have here?
I'm making a curry.
Really? And what, for Victoria?
Yes, a mid-Victorian curry recipe. We're told one thing about Queen Victoria, that she had simple taste, which is certainly true. She liked very much simple, wholesome foods, but she liked spicy food too.
And is that thanks to Abdul Karim?
Yes, he will have helped focus her attention on India. She was very proud of being Empress of India and embraced everything Indian, from her staff, her friends, and the food. A lot of people say there was a curry on the table every day. I don't think it quite goes that far when you look at the menus, but she loved her curries, and unfortunately it played into one of her problems with food. Queen Victoria ate too quickly.
Oh, right.
She was terrible for it. So what she does is, if you're sitting down to dinner with her, she gets her plate of food first. She's queen. She doesn't wait for you. She starts in there with it. And when she's had enough, she does a little wave and it's gone. And if you're at the end of the table and have only just got your bit of curry, that's gone as well. So you have to bolt it down.
And how similar are they to the curries that we'd eat today?
Very. They're basically a madras. All the recipes are very similar. They tell you to take your meat or fish. There's a lot of fish curries.
Oh, really?
All the way through the different fishes, and a lot of bits. Calf's head curry, calf's foot curry, anything you can imagine that they're going to put into stew, it goes in the curry.
Queen Victoria, you have to remember, was the Empress of India, and that was the jewel in the crown of the empire. So she had several Indian servants, but there was one particular servant, Abdul Karim, the Munshi, as he became known, who started teaching her Hindi and Urdu. She was always into languages. But they also talked about philosophy, they talked about history. He even introduces her to curry. Curry ends up on the menu. It wasn't new to England, but it ends up being a regular British meal, if you want, at this time.
There was a big age gap between these two people, but that doesn't mean to say that Abdul Karim didn't get anything from this. I mean, he was being introduced to the Queen of England. But also for Queen Victoria, this was a person that had new conversations, interesting things that he could offer her as well, the Indian culture, and different types of food that she'd not experimented with before. So there were things that both sides got from this friendship.
OK, so now it's time for the taste test, I think.
Yep, you need a spoonful of curry as it would have been enjoyed by Queen Victoria.
That's delicious.
Not bad at all. And the
but
spice comes through second.
It's starting to get hotter in my mouth. That is actually quite spicy, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
And she would have eaten it that hot.
We know she loved her curries and she had indigestion rather a lot.
There really is no wonder. As a consequence of her diet and lack of exercise, Victoria put on a phenomenal amount of weight, as so many photos of the Queen show. Kensington Palace has a unique and telling piece of Victoria's clothing, which is kept away from the public gaze in its storeroom. Senior curator Deirdre Murphy agreed to show it to me. I cannot wait to see what you're about to reveal. Wow. So, these are Queen Victoria's, what, bloomers? Knickers? What do we call them?
They're her drawers, and she wore them very late in her life. They date from around 1900, so just the year before she died. Thank you. And there they are.
Wow. Now, not being rude, but they're quite a size, aren't they?
They are quite a size. We have to remember that at this point, she's 80 years old, having had 9 children. And this is well before the era of women going to the gym to have size 8 bodies.
So she wouldn't really have exercised much in her life?
No, and she also had very early on developed a reputation for overeating. But they're a really personal and actually quite fascinating survival from her personal wardrobe.
It's amazing to think these were actually next to Victoria's skin. I mean, there was nothing underneath these. They're quite roomy, aren't they? I mean, they're sort of open here. They're rather like kind of curtains, aren't they? Is that what women would have worn at the time?
This is what women would have worn at the time. It's absolutely typical. They wore open drawers, and the purpose really was to be worn for warmth. They would be worn under quite voluminous skirts, and in a Northern European or British climate, a pair of drawers like these would help enormously with the cold, protecting the Queen from the cold.
Victoria was not tall. She was less than 5 foot. And physically, towards the end of her life, she had stopped taking care of herself, and that's very evident. And it may well be, I'm no psychologist, but it may well be that she was desperately unhappy, and that was one of the signs of it.
The difference between older Victoria and young Victoria is actually quite stark. We've seen the pictures of her. She puts on an awful lot of weight. She retreats into herself. She's not this fun, frivolous character of her youth anymore. She is this person that perhaps hides behind the black robes of grief that she continues to wear throughout the rest of her days, actually.
How do we know they're Victoria's? How can we be sure?
Well, we purchased them at auction and by descent from a family of a trusted staff member who received them as a gift from Queen Victoria. So the documentary evidence shows us that. But also, there's this monogram very beautifully embroidered at the waist that's a VR with a crown.
It's such a privilege to see such a personal memento of one of our most iconic queens, so thank you.
Pleasure.
On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died, aged 81. In keeping with her wishes, she was given a military funeral and was buried in a white dress wearing a wedding veil. She was Albert's loving wife, even in death. Victoria had written some 60 million words in her diaries, as well as countless letters. So you would think her private life would be there for all to see. But no. When she died, her children worked hard to cover up any potential embarrassments, and so her diaries were altered and few originals in her hands survive. Her son Bertie inherited the throne of England as Edward VII and ordered all evidence of her relationships with John Brown and Abdul Karim destroyed, going so far as to send agents to India.
Well, the fate of Abdul Karim is very telling about how the monarchy operates, because here's someone that was as close as anyone possibly could be to the Queen, to the Empress, and she promised him jewels, she promised him land, she promised him title. It was clear she was going to die before he would, but he was made all these promises and he sincerely believed them. But the minute she died, none of these promises were kept. They would not let this kind of alien from India, like who was cooking his curries for Queen Victoria, they didn't want him anywhere close to the next monarch, anywhere close to influencing the government or anything like that.
The monarchy, those around the Queen, those around Edward, who was about to take the throne, said this was unacceptable. And instead of giving him these things, they basically gave him a one-way ticket back to India. And they got rid of him. And they cleaned up this mess so that the British monarchy, the machinery of monarchy, could churn on. And he just stood in the way. And you don't stand in the way of this machine.
The evidence of the exciting, fun-loving and affectionate Queen is mostly gone, but it's certainly no longer forgotten. And perhaps it does reveal the truth about the real Queen Victoria.
I think our memory of Queen Victoria since she's died has been what we've seen in the statues, the statue on the Mall, the statue in countless cities around the world. It's this big, large lady, huge waist, morbidly obese, basically, at the end of her life. And what we didn't know about her, but we're just starting to discover, I mean, through some of the TV dramas, through some of the research, some of the letters that have come out in recent years, is this young Victoria who was very different, who was very flirty, who was very intelligent, who was very chatty, who had affairs. It's a completely different picture. Whether or not that kind of cancels out the other Victoria, well, we'll have to wait and see.
The thing that Victoria had, which all monarchs have, is this strange dual personality. They have their private life and they have their public life. And I think in the past, we've tended to overlook Victoria's private life more so than other monarchs because there's been the impression that it's not that interesting. Well, actually it is, and she was a very interesting woman. She was full of beans, full of life, and she enjoyed the company of men and women, men more so, throughout her life.
While it's clear that there's more to Victoria than the grand titles and popular images would suggest, perhaps we will never know the whole truth. But I'll leave you with this. Victoria was buried with several mementos of those dear to her. On one side of her was a cast of Prince Albert's hand, and on the other, hidden under a bouquet of flowers, a photograph of John Brown. I'll see you next time. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the longest reigning monarch in European history, and the French king who built this fabulous palace here at Versailles. But what actually went on inside? What is the truth about the king's tangled love life, his extravagant lifestyle, and extraordinary vanity? Did he really bathe only 3 times during his life? And was Versailles actually a filthy, smelly den of iniquity?
In his lifetime, Louis was an immensely successful king. He was grand, he was serious, he was hard, and he had a huge vision, and he was going to implement it. I am the state, he said. L'État, c'est moi.
He is one of those kings that is just a force of nature. His influence stretched across Europe. The fashions of France during his period, that all came from him, the monarch.
The life that was led at Versailles was so decadent and so over the top and so lavish. The entertainments that went on for days, and a kind of loose morality that was like nothing that most ordinary people could even conceive of.
This is excess, luxury and dictatorship to an extreme. He believed that the whole of France revolved around him, and that was his achievement.
In this episode, we examine the fashion of Louis's court, explore the real reason the king loved perfume so much, and discover the sumptuous meals he ate every single day. I'm Tracy Borman, and I'm going to take you behind the scenes to find out what really went on here at Versailles and in the private life of King Louis XIV. Louis XIV came into the world on September the 5th, 1638, at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. He then spent much of his early life here at the Palais Royal, in the centre of Paris. King Louis XIII died in 1643, and so, aged just 4, young Louis succeeded to the throne of France to reign as Louis XIV. During his childhood, his mother, Anne of Austria, served as regent with the formidable First Minister, Cardinal Mazarin, at her side. But in 1661, at the age of 22, Louis took over. From then on, he ruled alone.
His ambition meant that when he achieved his majority and became ruler, he didn't want to have a chief minister. He was going to do it all himself. But it was too much for one man to do. So in the process, he became at times vindictive, he became overly authoritarian, and he didn't really care about the nobles or the French people. His idea was a grandeur of France.
He had a real sense of the divine importance of monarchy and how he was God's representative on earth. And he was the centre of everything. And this is why he took the sun as his emblem. He wanted to be the sun, the centre of France, so that everything else would revolve around him. And he really built on this idea of him being the divinely appointed king of France.
He was called Dieu donné, God-given. And his first advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, said, you know, you rule by divine right, divine intervention. You rule because God wants you to rule. And then he calls himself the Sun King. So he believes that he is this divine royal personage. I mean, it's completely bonkers, but everybody, of course, buys into it.
During the early years of his reign, the royal court changed locations from here in Paris to the Palace of Versailles. When it was inaugurated in 1682, there was enough room to house the entire court of the king.
Life there revolved entirely around Louis, and the most important thing was to somehow gain the king's favour.
Versailles was like a giant gilded bubble. It looked great from the outside, but as soon as you opened the door, it was almost the opposite. It would have been a kind of difficult, quite inorganic place to live. This was the kind of the centre of the sun god's realm.
He was a very hard man, and he was a very serious man. To do what he wanted to do, which is bring all the nobility into one place and control them, he had to be despotic in his character. And he was. I don't think he was a very likable person.
He could have whatever he wanted in life. He could have any woman he wanted. He could have all of the material wealth, all of the clothing, all of the food. He could have beautiful palaces and carriages and gardens. And he went for it.
One of the ways to get noticed by the king was to be fashionable. A well-dressed courtier stood a much better chance of gaining influence. But then, as now, none of it came cheap, and the strict Versailles fashion code certainly helped empty the pockets of the great and the good. I've come to leading Parisian costume house Sommier, who have agreed to dress me to impress, Louis style. So, Barbara, you're going to be dressing me for the court of Louis XIV.
Yeah.
I already have the underlayer on. Can you talk me through it?
So you have your short blues, the
Okay.
ones that are going to wear under your dress.
Okay.
Not to show too much of your skin. Then you have white stockings, that you have to wear under your short pants.
Yes, yep.
And these nice shoes. This is just the very beginning. The first thing you have to put on is your basket.
My basket,
Your
okay.
basket.
Right.
I'm going to call for Stéphane. Because we're supposed to be 2 or 3 ladies to help you getting dressed.
Oh, really?
Yes. you
Not
have
just
to-
one lady's maid. I'll
No.
hold on to you while I step in. Okay,
Yes.
there's 1 and 2. Right.
This basket was to be worn under your dress. It was supposed to make your hip wider.
Why did they want wide hips?
Because they wanted a very, very slight waist.
So it accentuates the waist. It gives that nice sort of,
Yeah,
I was going
and-
to say hourglass figure. It's a bit more than that, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so now we have
So
the
you
dress.
have to put your dress on. The dress is very richly decorated, as you
Right.
can see.
And
So you
very
just
heavy.
put it from the head.
Right.
And as you will see, it was quite
Oh, yes.
heavy.
It is. It weighs a ton. And the material must have been
It was
so
made
rich.
of, yes, it was made of velvet, silk.
Okay.
You see the lace was coming maybe from the Republic of Venice.
Oh, so it's an international trade.
Yes.
Wow, okay. It's looking beautiful.
One of the prime features of Versailles was its focus on fashion and the way the nobles looked. In Versailles, each noble was being watched in terms of how the king was looking at them. So the competition was fierce. And one way they tried to outshine each other was in clothes and in opulence and in wealth. And many of them bankrupted themselves in the process. It was vicious competition.
So there must have been lots of other ladies all competing, all getting the
Yeah, but
finest dresses. And
So the king had a look for you. You are his favorite. It was done.
that was it. But it's very sexually charged, isn't it? The
It
court.
was very, very sexual charge. Everybody was flirting, there.
yeah.
And, it was a flirting period where everybody could sit at a table and try to catch the attention of the king.
Yes. And what if you failed? Had you wasted your time? If you didn't catch Louis' attention, was there anybody else?
Well, it was a big problem because you had to be, not only you had to be beautiful, but you had to be witty too. You had to have a good sense of humor. You had to be able to have a conversation and be able to distract him.
But
So,
presumably if you ended up with some high-ranking nobleman instead of Louis, then that's not too bad, is it? You haven't come away completely empty-handed.
Well,
Oh, it's getting nice and tight now.
The women of court knew that they could exert some power and influence through their sexuality. And if they could capture the notice of the king or anybody in power, but the king was really the peach, that's who you were going for, then an enormous door opened and there were all sorts of possibilities in your life.
The next thing is to wear a wig, men and women,
Okay, I'll
both
just
of them.
put my hair back,
Yeah,
like this
were,
for you.
were wearing wigs.
Yep.
So I'm going to adjust it because
When did they become so high like this?
one of the mistresses of Louis
Yep.
had an accident with a horse and her hair got caught in a branch of a tree.
Oh, really?
And then she had to tie her hair up, and
Yep.
the king loved it. And
So it was an accidental fashion.
And yeah, everybody copied it. In the court, when somebody was doing it, especially when it was a favorite, all
Yeah.
the other ladies were trying to copy her.
We've done our best, okay? I'm all decked out,
Yeah.
ready to go and catch Louis's attention. No matter how much discomfort I might be in, I have to appear, delighted to see Louis.
Oh, absolutely. It was a king's son, Le Roi Soleil, so you have to be totally in total admiration, but smile a lot.
Okay, I'll give it my best shot. Thank you, Barbara.
Good luck.
It was not uncommon, of course, for kings to have pretty interesting love lives. After all, it was almost expected that a monarch should keep mistresses, and Louis was no different. He had a very healthy libido, which enabled him to father 12 illegitimate children, and that was in addition to the 6 born him by his wife, Maria Theresa of Austria.
But this was not the first time that the king's marriage had faced difficulties. Rumours circulated at court that Queen Maria Theresa had given birth to a black baby. And then there was the mysterious black nun of Moray.
Louis said that kings should enjoy giving pleasure, and he lived by that maxim. He had about 20 mistresses. He was never faithful to his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, and he'd often arrive late back to bed with her way past midnight and say that paperwork had kept him busy, but he was constantly in bed with his other mistresses. I mean, Athénée de Montespan, he's supposed to have made love to her at least 3 times a day. She, meanwhile, saw off her rivals by spreading all sorts of calumnies about them, such as they had scabs all over their body. That was one of her favourites. She'd say that they had a bad case of the clap, that kind of thing. There was a huge amount of backbiting at court.
In Versailles, women were currency. Imagine you've got many thousands of people all swarming. It was like a giant beehive. They're all trying to catch the eye of the Sun King. Think of him, if you like, as the queen bee. And there's 3 ways they can do this. Firstly, through their natural looks, through their curves, through their natural proportions. Secondly, through the way that they're dressed. And thirdly, via their smell.
Obviously, there were many pros to catching the eye of the king. If you became the king's mistress, it would come with lots of other perks as well. You would have lovely new clothes, you would gain a position. Many of them bore him children, some even more children than his own wife, and he legitimised a lot of these children as well. So again, that's another perk. You could potentially be the mother of a future heir to the throne. There were many pros to catching the eye of Louis XIV.
Life in Versailles was run with military precision, with everything revolving around the king. Courtiers were expected to plan their days around his schedule. At 7:30 a.m. he rose. At 10, he attended Mass. At 11, he had council meetings, followed by a private lunch alone. At 2 p.m, he went on a hunt or had a walk. Then at 6 p.m, he read state papers and documents before eating a much larger meal in public around 10 p.m, and then retiring at around 11:30 p.m. On top of all that, the king came up with another rather ingenious way to use his routine to part nobles from their money. They could pay to watch him eat or bathe or even sleep.
Louis's life was completely public. And he wanted it to be public because it was a public display of his power. And he was at the center of everything. And people would come to watch the king do the most mundane things because he was this force to behold. In fact, What is so interesting is that if you look at the architecture of Versailles and his bedroom in particular, it has a sort of screen around the bed, which looks like a theatre. It's on a raised dais. The bed is part of a theatrical performance.
People thought of him as something of a god, and why not pay to go and see a god wake up or go to bed? It was all a kind of not so subtle way of him asserting and projecting his power, and it just kind of is testaments to the godlike status of the king, and also the whole cult that Louis managed to engineer that was so successful that people actually wanted to watch him, wake up bleary-eyed in the morning and get dressed. It makes the mind boggle today, but it was a big part of the culture of Versailles back then.
Louis's day revolved around him being the centre of attention. His entire life was one Truman Burbank public show. At Versailles, even the architecture demonstrates this, the centrality of his bedroom in the building. This was the Louis show.
But of all the activities that were surrounded by pomp and ceremony at Versailles, nothing matched mealtimes. While breakfast and lunch were private meals, the 10 o'clock dinner was a grand affair that was open to the whole court. To give some idea of its grandeur, it took 500 people to prepare and serve the meal, which was accompanied by musicians. Conversation was forbidden, lest it distract the king. Two other things. Louis preferred to eat with his fingers, even though forks were in common use by this time, and pointed knives were banned from the table.
Susan Loomis is an American chef who is an expert on the food and dining experiences of Louis XIV's court. She agreed to prepare an actual full meal that would have been served at Versailles.
One of his favorite dishes was oranges with caramel. I put vanilla sugar in here. So the caramel, when it caramelizes, it'll take a few minutes, but it'll have a little bit of a vanilla flavor.
Okay, and would he have had vanilla?
He would.
In his
he
court?
would, because of the spice route,
Yeah.
which was the Middle Ages. They had any spice they wanted,
Sure.
but they didn't really want many. But they did use vanilla. Okay, so we've got the sugar, it's all caramelized.
Okay.
I'm taking it over here to the oranges, all right, from up here.
Oh, that makes a very satisfying, sizzling sound. Wow, look at that. Now, that is a dish for a sweet tooth, isn't it?
Well, it is, and yet it's explosive because you bite into the oranges and they're juicy. Ooh. So it's crackly and it's
kind of like
juicy.
a toffee apple, but the orange
It's
version.
like a toffee
amazing.
orange,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
They would just wait for the caramel to turn hard. And then we've got another amazing thing for this dish.
Could it get
which
more
is-
amazing?
Well, remember, this is one of Louis's favorites. Oranges, caramel. The other thing he loved, however, was gold.
Of course he did.
So what we have here is edible gold.
Edible gold.
Yep.
Look at this. You can see why Louis loved it. It's all about the bling, isn't it?
It's all about the bling and how good he could feel about being such a wealthy king and really appointed by God.
And it's just decadence, because this doesn't taste of anything. It's really just for show.
No, it's just to make him feel good in his wealth.
So Versailles parties would go on for days, and there would be a crowd that would be taken along to have a feast first of all, and there'd be gold-sprinkled meals, soups with gold leaf and truffles, and then they'd go and watch a play by Molière or one of his pet playwrights, and then they'd go and they'd watch this massive fireworks display behind the palace, illuminating all the statues and the fountains, and so the luxuriance, there was no expense spared by Louis for these kind of parties.
Tracy, we've got some foie gras here. I'm gonna slice it up into portions, okay? These are called escalopes. And this just makes it a little bit easier to cook, all right? So it's a very quick process. It goes in the pan.
Very, very hot pan.
Yep. Gotta be a hot pan. All right?
Okay.
So what you're going to do is turn the pieces and shake the pan simultaneously.
Oh, right.
Multitasking, multitasking.
Like that. Okay.
Yep,
You
and
show
then-
me. Right. Let me have a
All
go.
right.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
good. Good.
What am I looking for? When do we know it's
So
done?
you see the color of it mostly,
Yeah.
and you don't want to leave it too long because you can see it's melting.
Yeah, it's
so
darkening quite a
I
lot.
want you to turn over here to this plate
Okay.
and put the pieces on the plate. You're done.
Lovely.
It's about a minute, all told.
And this would be served straight away, piping hot.
Straight away, and you can pour the fat over it, and then put the pan back on the stove. Perfect.
Wonderful. Okay.
All right. There we go. That's ready to go.
Beautiful.
All right.
Okay.
Louis's extravagant meals were not just reserved for parties. He ate like this every single day. The king would be served everything from asparagus à la crème to jus de bœuf, lapin en sauce, and foie gras. It all sounds rather decadent and excessive, but having gone to all the trouble of preparing such a meal, I have to try it.
I want you to try the beef cheeks, which was one of the dishes that Louis would have started his meal with. So there's
Thank you.
that.
Now, I know Louis would eat with his hands often, wouldn't he? But I'm going to be more polite. I'm going to try this.
And he always ate off of a silver plate.
That is absolutely delicious. Okay. What should we go for next, do you think?
Next, I think you need to try the foie gras. You know, foie gras is a signature of French food, and it always has been. This is something that Louis would have probably served atop a chicken breast or something like that, but we're trying it just like this today.
Just sautéed. Do the French still eat it like this today?
Oh, absolutely they do. Are you kidding? And this is locally grown the way it would have been during Louis's time.
That is delicious.
We read about these excesses and we think this is really extraordinary, but it's not as shocking to us as it would have been to the people of the era, the ordinary common people of the era, for whom it was a struggle just to get bread. And here is a man who's basically eating his way through a flock of swans and, 20 other courses. And, sitting on gilded chairs and washing his hands in wine and doing these types of things. And it just would have been inconceivable to the ordinary person.
Now, the other thing Louis loved to do, I want you to try a little orange caramel and gold leaf.
It's going to be quite a healthy dessert, apart from the huge amount of sugar poured over it.
Yes, but you've only got a little sugar on that. And what Louis would have done is he would have taken a whole orange and popped it in his mouth.
And it's still crunchy, the caramel.
Isn't that great? And, while he's eating by himself, but streams of people are being led by him. So they can look at the table, they can look at him eating. That is a huge court privilege.
I'm not sure how I'd feel about having an audience while I eat, but you know what? It's worth it, because this is a feast fit for a king.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Louis.
And there's only one other thing for it but to say salut.
Merci.
Now, we've heard a lot about the opulence of Versailles, with all its splendid pomp and ceremony. But it did have a less grand side. Let's not forget that on occasion, many hundreds of people could be crowded into the palace, and there were hardly any toilets. So when nature called, people simply relieved themselves in the corridors and courtyards. The very many dogs that roamed around did the same. The smell was revolting. In fact, Versailles became known as the filthiest palace in the world.
Versailles is just as glorious as it ever was. Sprawling palatial rooms, incredible decor, incredible furniture, everybody dressed beautifully. But it smelled terribly. It smelled like drains.
What you used to have were these little, sort of like waiters, but they'd be carrying piss pots, and you would sort of hail one of them, and a little boy would come scuttling over. But sometimes you couldn't wait. You would just do it there in front of you or behind the curtain, and with excrement as well. So this was all done out in the open. They didn't have the same ideas as privacy as we have today. So this kind of heady brew of sweat and human excrement and urine, this would have followed you around like a kind of hellish miasmic concoction, and it would have taken you a long time to get used to that.
Versailles stank to high heaven. You know, this was a hellhole as far as most aristocrats were concerned. They were dying to get back to their country estates. Instead, they were stuck in what, frankly, was a gilt-edged prison.
The place was smeared in filth, and these nobles had to be there. If they weren't seen at court, they were no one. So even if their estates were falling apart back where they came from, even if they couldn't afford the clothes to be there for the morning waking of the king, they had to. It was vermin-infested, it was unhygienic, it was foul, it was smelly. It's not remotely the place we see it as being, but that was the court that Louis built.
There was another aspect of Louis's life that has caused a fair amount of debate, and that was his personal hygiene. It's said that he only bathed 3 times during his life, which seems unlikely, although we have to remember that at that time, bathing was considered a health hazard because it was thought that it opened up the body's pores to diseases like the plague.
So you have to imagine at the height of summer, you know, a warm Parisian evening, that the smell in the palace must have been absolutely unbelievable. I mean, it starts with the king himself. He's said to have only had 3 baths in his life. He was petrified of waterborne illnesses. The only way he kept clean was to keep changing his undergarments. This is what most of the aristocracy did. So they changed their undergarments 2-3 times a day, but otherwise they weren't washing. And in fact, it's even said that one of Louis's mistresses couldn't abide the smell of the king. I mean, she pretty much had to pinch her nose while she was in the act. And then, of course, you had all the dogs, you had all the people, leaving all their stuff all over the floors if they couldn't get to a piss bucket. So the whole effect is pretty horrible. It's this weird mélange of perfume and excrement hanging all over the palace.
You and I, with our very modern sense of smell, would probably not have enjoyed being in Louis's company, because apart from the unpleasant body odours, he's also supposed to have had terrible halitosis. It was apparently so bad it caused rows between Louis and at least one of his mistresses. But actually, the Sun King wasn't quite the reeking monarch of legend. He was a huge fan of perfumiers, whose sole job was to keep the royal person fragrant, just like this shop here.
Emmanuel is a master perfumier at Candora Perfumes in Paris, who has agreed to explain the lengths that people would have gone to please Louis at the time, and the important job they had to sweeten the air around the monarch.
So, Emmanuel, the reason I've come here today is not just to talk about how bad it smelt, but what people did about it.
Well, perfume making was amazing at that time, and there's a complete switch on this century between some scents that were used for medical purpose to scents that would be to really smell good. Really, there were some people, very crafted people, who started knowing completely how to take good smells from nature. And Martial was the perfume maker for the king. He was the valet of the king's brother. And Martial was very good at making perfumes.
And was there one scent that was particularly favoured by Louis?
Yes, orange blossom. In fact, Louis loved orange trees. He had some brought to Versailles, and they were very, very keen on the smell of orange blossom. So extracting the smell of orange blossom is very costly. You need something like 1 ton of petals to make 1 kilo of extract. Then you use the extract into your formula. This is one scent that, for example, he loved until the very end of his reign. When he couldn't stand all the perfumes at the end, he said that orange blossom was still possible to wear.
One of the things that men and women did to cover up this terrible smell was to use perfume. And now this was the heyday of the perfumer. This was when perfume was really coming into its own. So people would apply it to their skin. They'd spray perfume into their powdered wigs if they were wearing them. They would have... They would carry perfume around in pouches with them around the palace. And this is how they tried to negate the stench from the usual human mess and animal mess that was around the palace.
Well, Tracy, now I'd like to show you how a perfume was made for Louis XIV.
So one of the original perfumes
Yes,
that he would have
one
worn.
of the perfumes that would be made. First, they would need some raw materials to be taken, and it could be rosemary like this, or it could be for him with orange blossom petals. They would fill it into this part of the alembic, and then have some water boiled under it to get what they call the essence and what we would nowadays call essential oil. Then those would be blended, and there could be a little blend that would be made then with some orange blossom, some rose, and a little bit of musk, because they were very fond of those animal, very, very strong animal scents. And this is really the idea of the discussion they would have then with Martial, between Martial and Louis. They would not use scent strips, but probably a piece of cloth, and there would be then the reaction.
That's lovely. It's quite spicy.
It's spicy, it's very strong because of the musk that we are using, and then you have the balance with the orange blossom that is behind it.
It wasn't as though the whole nobility wore Chanel No. 5 or some other brand. They all had their own distinctive scent, and that was meant to be a projection of your personality. These were very complicated, textured perfumes, and they didn't just kind of spray a bit on your neck and a bit on your wrists. They would douse themselves in it. Literally, entire bottles would be poured over their heads. The stench would have been utterly overwhelming, nauseating, a sort of olfactory nightmare, one might say. And this would have been one of the kind of distinguishing features of walking into Versailles.
His power, Louis was not exactly a secure man. In fact, he was downright paranoid. Suspicious courtiers who fell under the royal gaze were spied upon, and it was rumoured that the king himself would rifle through closets containing the underwear of his women if he thought something wasn't right.
Louis, like all great monarchs and leaders, was absolutely paranoid. He was paranoid that somebody would be plotting against him. That's why he brought all of the nobles together in Versailles, so he could keep an eye on all of them and know what they were doing. He even opened a lot of the courtiers' letters as well, so he could read about what they were getting up to. He never overcame this paranoia that somebody was plotting against him. And it's entirely likely that had he not unified the court at Versailles, that somebody would have been plotting against him.
When Louis was young, there'd been a major rebellion of the aristocracy that completely freaked him out, and he never forgot that. So he never trusted the aristocrats, and that's why he put them all in one place. And he got people to spy on them. All their mail was opened. I mean, they could assume that any letter they got had been seen by the king's spies. And he even went to the lengths of going through their top drawer, basically, through the knickers, through the stockings, and having a look to see if there was anything there that was incriminating. He wanted to know everything that his courtiers were up to.
He lived until his last hours, terrified that the nobles may rise against him. His whole life was one effort to control them. At the heart of Louis's idea of who he was and how he had to control the nobility was the idea that he was everything. He would be one king. There would be one law. There would be one faith. And he would be at the center of all of them.
King Louis XIV ruled at a time when France was at the very height of her international powers. So you'd imagine being the monarch was pretty much a full-time role. But the time pressures of the job certainly didn't stand in the way of feeding the king's very well-developed personal vanity. Louis commissioned no fewer than 300 portraits of himself during his reign, which works out at roughly one every 3 months. Paris-based art historian Christine Bolte is an expert on Louis's love of art.
So, Christine, you have some portraits to show me of Louis, and I think we're going to start with the most famous one, aren't we?
Indeed. It is his most famous portrait. It is the ultimate image of the absolute monarch. Now, what makes it the absolute monarch? Well, many things: the coronation robes, the Order of the Holy Spirit, which is the French equivalent of the Order of the Garter, right. The sword, the scepter, the crown, the red-heeled shoes, which were only given to those who were admitted to court at Versailles.
And all of this would have been understood by the people at the time?
Absolutely understood. But the most impressive is what I would like to call the body language. This is the powerful pose. And I suggest to everybody that try standing that way. You will be more important than you ever were before in your life.
Louis had hundreds and hundreds of portraits commissioned, and these were sent. They didn't just circulate within Versailles and Paris, they went all over the country. And we might think at first glance that this was just appealing to the man's vanity, but it actually went much deeper than that. It was all part of a well-calculated, preordained political strategy. It was all part of extending his authority. And it worked at the time. People did begin to revere him. People began to think of him as this kind of being that was above them, someone who had a legitimate right to rule.
Next is an image of our same king as a teenager.
This looks very different. I mean, it doesn't even look like Louis.
No, it doesn't. He's 17 at the time. He has all his hair, because he did lose his hair. He is shown as Jupiter. And the point of this picture really was that there was an attempt to overthrow the crown when Louis was a young boy. He and his mother fled from Paris. They lived away. This very, very difficult period. And this is, in a sense, a reaffirmation of, I am the king. I'm not only Jupiter, but I'm the king too. And he's shown in an imperial Roman fashion.
This is really then a statement of power. He's trying to safeguard his position.
Absolutely. Really. It is a reaffirmation of actually his right to be the king.
Louis XIV believes that he is the Sun King, that he is a godlike figure. And so these portraits that he had done of himself, they were almost like religious icons. When they were in the room, the king was in the room. And often when he went away, a portrait would be put up on the wall, and that was the king in the room. So they weren't just ordinary paintings. They had a kind of power that was supposed to remind everybody at Versailles who the king was, even if he wasn't there.
Now I think we have to have at least one picture of our ruler in a more bellicose fashion. What is interesting is he is shown in his suit of armor with the fleur-de-lis on it. He's got the blue sash, which is again the Order of the Holy Spirit. He holds this very fancy-looking tube in his hand, and this was what was used to command your troops. It is a baton of commandment. He is being crowned here by the laurels of victory. But what is also interesting is not only is he on the horse, but the two front hoofs are up in the air. This was the most difficult position of any equestrian maneuver. It could be maintained for a matter of seconds only. And the fact that he, Louis, can actually control the horse to this degree is a sign he can control the country.
The king used portraits in the same way that dictators in the 20th century use images of themselves. It's to remind everybody who is there, who is behind the power. So even if Louis wasn't present, his portrait would be trotted out, and you had to show the same amount of deference and respect to the portrait as you would to the man himself. You couldn't turn your back on the portrait, for example. You had to behave in the same courtly manner. You had to observe etiquette as if the man himself were present in the room. And it was this sense of all-powerful, almost big brother watching them.
So, Christine, this has been absolutely fascinating because I've always known that Louis was a great lover and patron of the arts. But actually, what you've clearly demonstrated is there was so much more behind it. It was political propaganda. It wasn't just art for art's sake, was it?
No, absolutely not. There was nothing for anything's sake as far as Louis was concerned. All things had a purpose or could be directed towards the ends that he wished to achieve.
In the summer of 1715, Louis, now 76 years old, began to complain of pains in his leg. The pains worsened, the leg turned gangrenous, and by late August of that year, it was obvious the king was dying. Suffering in the confines of his bedchamber at Versailles, 4 days before his 77th birthday, Louis XIV died on the 1st of September. He had been king for 72 years, the longest reign in the history of France.
Even in death, Louis was still a public show. Since the time of King Philip the Fair in the 1300s, French kings had had themselves cut into 3 pieces, dismembered 3 ways. Louis had this done to himself, but in public, in his rooms in Versailles. He was too great a character to only be buried in 1 place. He was going to be buried in 3. So this was done as a public spectacle.
It's almost as if Louis XIV hypnotized France. You know, they lost all sense of reality. He created this, this wonderland, this Disney world, this royal Disney world in Versailles. The moment he dies, though, the dream starts to fall apart under his successors. And I mean, 80 years after his death, his own bones are dug up and they're just tossed aside during the French Revolution. And I think you have to see the French Revolution as payback for what Louis had done. He created this absolutist monarchy that, frankly, the French people, who felt completely excluded from the party, hated and resented. And eventually, of course, it ends with one of his successors getting his head chopped off.
Louis XIV was sort of wildly extravagant, and I think the French people did identify with that, and they were actually grateful for it at the time. But it sowed the seeds for the downfall of the monarchy, because when times got tough, when the monarchy went bankrupt, by the reign of Louis XVI, all of a sudden, it is this idea that you're paying people to watch you sort of get up and get dressed, and these elaborate feasts, that just made the whole monarchy look completely out of touch, and it incentivized the public to rise up and chop off all of their heads.
And so he was gone. The Sun King was no more. There aren't many kings that encapsulate an era as well as a reign, but Louis XIV was certainly one. He'd left his mark on his country's history and on its culture, not to mention putting an indelible stamp on the national identity. He wasn't always popular, and there were those glad to see the back of him. But if you're looking for a royal private life with glamour, scandals, love affairs, and all the rest, well, the Sun King is not a bad place to start. I'll see you next time.
the truth about the madness of King George III? What condition caused his suffering? And how has fascinating recent analysis challenged long-held theories? How true are the stories about his son, the Prince Regent's gluttony and love of excess? And how did this era provide inspiration for the first political cartoonists?
George III was somebody who took being a king very, very seriously. I mean, he tried to be a good king in spite of all his faults. He lost America. He had a very dysfunctional family. In the end of the day, he comes across as a bit dull, but otherwise a solid monarch.
If we know any one fact about George III, it's the fact that he was the Mad King. Eventually, he was completely consumed by this sort of strange form of madness that was in his blood. It was at that point that Prince Regent started eyeing up the throne for himself.
For most people that knew George IV, they disliked him. He was described as a cowardly, contemptuous dog by one of his aides. He was not a nice person.
George IV was a pleasure-loving, lascivious, hard-drinking, hard-gambling, venal, vindictive, nasty, small-minded ruler. The worst monarch this country has ever had.
In this episode, we examine the decline and madness of King George III, the cartoons that scandalise the monarchy, as well as the gargantuan appetites and lifestyle of his son, the new George IV. I'm Tracy Borman, and I'm here to try and find the answers to these and many more fascinating questions as we tell the remarkable story of the private lives of King George III and the Prince Regent. In October 1760, at the age of just 22, George William Frederick became the third Hanoverian king of Great Britain and Ireland. He was only heir to the throne because in 1751 his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, had died from a lung abscess, which was believed to have been caused by a blow from a cricket ball. But what kind of man had ascended to the throne? And why was he known as Farmer George?
George III came from a line of German kings. You know, he is the first of the Hanoverians who tries to project the fact that he is English, he is British. He's a 22-year-old, and he says to the country, I am British. I was born in this country, not in Germany. He wanted to be regarded as totally British.
He became a monarch quite young. He was quiet. He wasn't as intellectual as some of his predecessors, but he wasn't as abysmal as others of his predecessors as well. He was kind of average in intelligence.
George lived like a country squire. He was interested in agricultural matters. He was interested in frugality, in penny pinching. He was interested in his little scientific projects. He was not interested in fashionable society. He was not interested in making a splash. He wanted a very simple and very plain existence.
Of course, this was the era of arranged marriages, and after a thorough official search through a list of the available women in Europe, it was decided that Charlotte, the daughter of the Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was a suitable match for the new king. And it took place behind those windows in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Amazing as it now sounds, George had never met his future wife before the day of the wedding. You'd think that unpromising start might have made a successful union unlikely. But this was to be a very happy marriage that lasted for 57 years and produced 16 children. At a time when it was almost expected that a king should keep mistresses, George never did.
Lots and lots of women from around Europe had been assessed. Many had been found to be inappropriate. And finally, they fixed on this Princess Charlotte. And she was chosen not because she was a great beauty, but because she was thought to be sensible and OK and open to the way of life in England, and marriage to George as well.
Here was George, who married Charlotte, who was known to be this rather unattractive German princess who he had never met, who he stayed absolutely faithful to throughout his marriage.
George was very different to many of the monarchs who came before and afterwards, in that he really was devoted to his queen, whom he didn't know that well. It was still a formal marriage, but the letters between them, particularly when he became insane later in life, they're extraordinarily tender. These two had a very special bond, and he was faithful to her. For the period and the several hundred years beforehand, that makes George almost unique.
Behind me is one of the most famous buildings in the world, Buckingham Palace. But it certainly wasn't that when King George purchased it as plain old Buckingham House in 1761. He bought it as a London retreat for his family, while his main and favoured residences were Kew Palace and Windsor Castle.
In 1761, George III buys this house, Buckingham House. It's quite close to St James's Palace. It's intended to be a kind of family home, but to be honest, it was a pretty ramshackle place. It was a kind of a hunting lodge, and it's nothing like the building that you see today. So there was no grand facade. It's really a kind of a retreat almost, but right next to the palace.
He was a man of simple, modest tastes. He was Farmer George. He didn't really want to spend that much longer in London than he had to, so he tended to, appear in St James's Palace, but then he would retreat to Kew or to Windsor as quickly as possible. The urbane life wasn't for him.
George got the nickname Farmer George because he wasn't really interested or suited to the politics and high international diplomacy. What he really loved was plants and flowers and farming. The time he spent at Kew and at Windsor in his garden were the happiest times in his life.
King George may have been a lot of things, but he certainly wasn't a traveller. In fact, he spent his entire life in southern England. He even took his family on holidays to the delights of the southern coast. And he loved bathing in the sea, but not as the average person does it today. One of the King's favourite holiday resorts was Weymouth in Dorset, which has a famous beach. And where there's a beach, there's water in which to swim, which was exactly what the King did. However, this was not a sun lounger, beach towel, bottle of sun cream type affair. No, when George went bathing, he did so in a manner befitting his royal status.
As the monarch, not just of England, but Britain as well, and a burgeoning empire, you need some time out. So he went to Weymouth, and the reason he went there was to take the waters for its kind of health-giving and therapeutic benefits.
So you have to imagine George III going down to the beach. This is not like a modern beach holiday. I mean, he would go down in what was described as a bathing machine. So he'd be pushed down to the sea, and nearby was a band that would be playing God Save the King as if it wasn't there. And then he would emerge in some kind of bathing robe, because obviously you didn't show your body off in those days, and process down to the sea and cover himself in seawater in the hope that this would take away all his various ailments.
He went every year to Weymouth to do this, because George, in his heart, was a creature of habit. He liked plain things. He liked to just do the same thing that he would always do.
George III's passion for bathing and medicine wasn't his only intellectual interest. Here at the Science Museum in London, they have some unique artefacts from the King's life, and I've been given special permission to take a look with one of the curators, Jane Desborough.
That's incredible. So here we are in the conservation labs. Just get the lights.
Wow. Now, these look intriguing objects. What are they?
So here we have two objects from the King George III collection. On the one hand, we've got the very shiny and high-end instruments made by the George Adams family of instrument makers for George III.
So tell me what this was for.
So this is mechanical powers apparatus, and that means mechanical powers are pulleys and levers. The demonstrator would use the different weights on these different series of pulleys. And this was very important at the time because although people had always been interested in different pulleys and the way that great weights such as stones or cargo could be lifted, they really wanted to work out the principles behind efficient lifting and choose the right kind of pulleys for the job that they needed to get done.
We think of George as a Spartan, modest, almost quite a backwards figure. It's since come to light that there was another side to him, and this kind of veneer of simplicity cloaked a brilliant mind. And he was incredibly sort of scientifically acute, and he's almost left a kind of 800 sort of gadgets that he used to kind of play with and measure almost on a daily basis. And we still have his calculations based on the transit of Venus, which occurred during his reign. And the entire thing is absolutely meticulous. It's almost like he's a bit of an obsessive. So this was completely sort of hidden by the image that he used to portray to the public.
If I can show you the next model. This is a model pile driver. The full-scale version would have been used in the construction of Old Westminster Bridge.
Oh, really?
So here we've got this print, if I can show you this, of how the pile driver worked. As you can see, it was floating on the river. There were horses that operated the capstan. If I show you on the main model here, so the horses would have turned this capstan. That would have lifted this weight over here that would have been taken up to the top and then let go to drive the piles into the riverbed.
So given this was a huge part of his life, and there are, what, 800 objects, you said, in the collection, why has it been forgotten?
I don't know. I mean, that's something that we here really want to push so that people understand that other side to George, because it is so important and fascinating, and he should be known as that person who was so intrigued into everything. So.
It's been a total revelation for me. It's really changed my opinion of George, so I'm very grateful to you for showing me them. Thank you.
Yeah, it's wonderful to show you them.
George was a much more complex man than he's often given credit for being. He was fascinated with the arts. He was the patron of the Royal Academy. He had a massive collection of books, which later became the essence of the British Library. He was a man who was fascinated with intellectual pursuits and engaged in them. And he was what we would think of as an enlightened monarch, a man of his time.
But of course, when we think of King George III, we think first of his so-called madness, the recurring bouts of terrible mental illness, which affected the king from 1788 until the end of his life. For many years, the cause of the king's illness was believed to be an inherited condition called porphyria, but very recent research has shed some doubt on that.
George III had 3 very serious episodes of insanity. We don't know exactly what it was. People have come up with different ideas over the years. For a long time, it was porphyria. It's possible. People now like to talk more about a bipolar disorder, which is also possible. But what is certain is that he had serious insanity for these periods.
The loss of the American colonies dealt an extremely severe psychological blow to the king. Just imagine you had this huge empire. Territorially, it was the biggest empire the world had seen since Rome, and then suddenly a whole part of it is just lopped off. It's gone, it's vanished, it's not part of Britain anymore.
It was a trait of his that if he allowed himself to be upset by something, he really went into a deep state of melancholy, and this was the biggest shake-up of his life that he'd had to that date.
he lost a tremendous amount of land, a tremendous amount of territory, which belonged to Britain. And so that was a personal failure. And George saw it as a personal failure. And in fact, he even drafted a resignation letter, which he never submitted. But it's unlikely that he ever fully recovered from this terrible loss.
Dr. Peter Garrard from St George's University in London has studied the king's madness in detail and strongly suspects that the widely held belief that he had porphyria is in fact wrong. And he says he knows that from his detailed analysis of the king's handwriting.
So Peter, what does your research tell us about the handwriting of George? I know you've looked at this in quite some depth.
We have this timeline of texts and scripts of King George, which go through a period, several decades of his life, and pass through periods where he's mentally healthy, mentally unwell. And what we found was that those two types of language that he used in his letters during those two periods could be teased apart. The features of the two periods were different. So here's a letter that King George wrote in, I think, 1786. Here it is, right at the bottom. We can see it's written in this beautiful script, lovely straight lines. It's a letter to one of his members of his government, my good lord, very politely signed off with this beautiful signature at the end. And this is from a very healthy, mentally healthy period of George's life in 1786. So that's 2 years before this index period of madness occurred.
It's beautifully written, it's very neat and orderly,
yes,
reflecting his mind at that stage.
So there's always been a certain amount of mystery about what the king was suffering from. I mean, the external symptoms were talking at a massive rate for hours on end, foaming at the mouth, saying the most bizarre things. Was that caused by a disease of the blood? I mean, people talk about his urine being blue and that it was porphyria. Some people say no, it was bipolar, and it was actually the medicine that was turning his urine blue. So there's a bit of a mystery as to what he actually had. But the end result is that George III went barking mad, whatever the cause.
This is a nice sequence of 4 letters, written 1779. And I think perhaps we can see in this that it's slightly less precise than before. The lines are nice and straight, but there's perhaps a little bit more variation in the size of the letters.
You can see that. There's something less ordered about it, this first one there in particular. And then when we look at this one down here, dated 1805, that is quite different, isn't it?
Yes, well, this is probably one of the last letters that King George wrote in his own hand. It's difficult to know whether to attribute the untidiness of this to his cognitive decline or to his visual decline, and I suspect there are elements of both in that.
It's absolutely fascinating, though, isn't it, to see this written record of George's health in this way.
There are a lot of theories about George's quote-unquote madness. Some believe that he may have had a kind of manic-depressive bipolar disorder that he was suffering from. But he was most certainly suffering from some sort of mental disability.
The House of Hanover was probably one of the most dysfunctional royal dynasties in British history. To put it mildly, many of them never got on. And King George III and his son, also named George, carried on that family tradition. Where King George was thrifty and down to earth, his eldest son was spendthrift and dissolute. The king certainly wasn't very fond of him, and the feeling was mutual.
The Georges, the Hanoverians, were very well known for having colossally dysfunctional relationships down the generations and for fathers and sons not to get on. But the relationship between George III and George IV was one of the most spectacularly dysfunctional and diametrically opposed.
For as abstemious and frugal and miserly as George III was, George IV was extravagant, lazy, a womanizer, a glutton, didn't care about being a good ruler, was in it for himself, had no moral fibre. He was completely the opposite of his father.
In 1783, at the tender age of 21, the prince had fallen in love with a lady called Maria Fitzherbert. In fact, he became infatuated with her. It was, as they say, never going to work. Maria was a twice-widowed commoner, 6 years his elder, and worst of all, a Roman Catholic. The Act of Settlement of 1701 barred the spouse of a Catholic from succeeding to the throne. But the prince obviously didn't see this as a problem, because he married Maria in secret in 1785.
One thing that the Hanoverians liked more than anything else was a secret marriage, and this is what George IV did. He married without permission before his father died. His uncles had done the same thing. It was forbidden, but he did it anyway, and this kind of set the tone for the rest of his life.
His father had had to pay his gambling debts, had to pay off women who were blackmailing him because he basically offered them huge amounts of money to go to bed with him, and then not paid them. And then there was Maria Fitzherbert, his secret wife, his Catholic wife that the Prince Regent had married, much to the horror of his father. So his father had absolute contempt for his son. His son, in turn, you know, in the early part of the reign, obviously couldn't do anything to get his own back on his father, but once the madness descended, then there was the opportunity to get his own back on his father.
So, with an apparently mad king on the throne and his extravagant son waiting in the wings, the monarchy became a ripe target for a new style of criticism, the political cartoon. These included James Gilray and the man described as the modern Hogarth, George Cruikshank. They portrayed George as fat, lazy, and an Olympic-sized lover of the good life. Martin Rowson has been a cartoonist for The Guardian newspaper for over 20 years and is a great admirer of Gilray.
So, Martin, you've got quite a wonderful collection of cartoons here. Can you talk me through some of them?
Yeah, well, I've got this pile of Gilray's about George III and the Prince Regent. And, I mean, this is a good one to start off with because it shows quite how far they were prepared to push things. So it's a pastiche of Fuseli's oil painting of the Three Witches from Macbeth. But it's dealing with an extremely sensitive topic, which is the madness of King George. And there he is as the moon. He's been eclipsed. So he's in darkness because he's gone mad. You can just see this sort of half moon of the Queen. Will she be taking over the regency? And here is Pitt the Younger and other members of the government, like the Lord Chancellor, sort of pondering over the eclipse of the madness of the King. But that was small beer compared to how far Gilray and his contemporaries were prepared to go. I mean, they were prepared to do really, really close to the wire stuff. So here is the Prince Regent, the Prince of Wales, as a goat with his mistress, Lady Jersey, the mountains of Wales, and various figures dancing around the place.
It's quite shocking, isn't it? It's closer to the bone than we would ever dare go with our royals.
It's about as close to the bone as you can get, because this one, for example, you have the reigning monarch, George III, who is being told about the assassination of the King of Sweden by Pitt the Younger, and he is sitting at stool.
He is. He's on his clothes.
And there's no particularly good reason why he should be depicted in this way, except, of course, it's funny. It's a gag. It's a joke.
The type of satire that Gilray engaged in would have been regarded by us today as incredibly vicious. He mocked George III's frugality. You know, he had him eating off threadbare tables. He mocked the fact that George III wasn't into courtly life and that he was into going and tending his turnips. And he was mocked as Farmer George in his own lifetime. You know, things that particularly went bad about a monarch, but then seemed to be regarded as hilarious.
There's this wonderful couple of companion pieces by Gilray, produced in 1792, and it's comparing George III with his son. And on the one hand, you have George III, temperance enjoying a frugal meal. And he's so frugal, he's not going to wear out his royal chairs. Here is the triumph of benevolence, which is an empty frame because he's so tight with money. There is the Queen eating raw vegetables, and he's eating an egg off gold cutlery. But it's this idea of frugality and actually meanness. And you compare that with the image of his son, the Prince of Wales, who is this bloated, fat glutton
Yeah.
who just crammed full of food, the bones of his breakfast left there looking like the remnants of a cannibal feast. In the background, there's this kind of pyramid of potions which are all there to treat syphilis. He's just a disgusting, dirty, fat, pox-ridden pig. And just to gild the lily, as it were, behind him you can see this over-brimming chamber pot filled with the consequences of eating and drinking too much.
Gilray didn't hold his punches. He portrayed him as this kind of gluttonous mountain of flabber that would just kind of eat anything that came anywhere near him. The sort of underlying message was that he was quite a sort of corrupt and decadent king. So it wasn't just about eating, it was about his kind of attitude towards government as well. So for Gilray, George III and his son George IV were sort of brilliant fodder.
As long as you cause discord and chaos, you will be restrained, sir.
I
Put his head
am the
Put his head
king! Stop that!
With the king's health in decline and the court physicians clearly baffled, the Queen brought in a new doctor to treat the king. His name was Francis Willis. Willis still employed the accepted methods of the time, which included physical restraint and blistering of the skin. And the king wasn't spared.
Dr. Willis had trained first as a priest, and then in later life had retrained as a doctor. And he'd had a huge amount of success treating wealthy and noble people for mental issues, which wasn't a branch of medicine that was particularly focused on at the time. So he was called in when all other avenues failed with George. And his techniques were to calm George down, to take him back to the nursery almost, as it were, and treat him like a child.
However, he was not averse to using more traditional methods, so methods of restraint and coercion, which would have been deeply humiliating for the king who didn't have to respond to anybody if he didn't want to.
By the year 1810, the king's mental and physical health had broken down to the point where even he accepted he couldn't carry on. And so Parliament, without the king's consent, handed power to the king's son, who became the Prince Regent in 1811. He now had the control and power that he desired and left his mad father to see out his final years locked away and out of the public eye. I've come to Kensington Palace in London to meet Isabella Carassa, who has arranged to show me the waistcoat George III wore during his final days.
Okay. Oh, look at that.
Yes.
That's astonishing.
So this is George III's sleeved waistcoat.
Wow.
We actually think this is from 1820, the year that he passed, and it really shows the condition of his health at that point.
And what clues does this give us of George's so-called madness?
Well, actually, it gives us a lot of clues. So the first one, the enlarged sleeves. So we have a little panel adding a little bit more to the shoulder. And that would have helped his servants dress him, would have given a little bit more give to the clothes, because at this point, it's not only he was, as they called, mad, but his hearing, his sight, they were all going. So he was in a very much vulnerable state.
He sort of became something of a vegetable. He retreated into himself. He lost touch with reality, and he started babbling for hours on end. On one occasion, he babbled for over 50 hours. Just babble, babble, babble. His hair was grown long, so he looked like a sort of Merlin figure, and he would foam at the mouth. You know, with all the kind of spectacle of monarchy, this is the very last thing that you wanted to happen to a ruler, so he had to be kept away.
And what about these stains here? Is that just aging, or what is it?
Well, they're definitely food and drink stains. From which point the food had come out, it's not really certain. It could have been just dropping, or it could have been dribble, could possibly have been vomit as well. Yes, it's really hard to tell, but it does show that he was having difficulties eating. But you can definitely see, like throughout the waistcoat, this all shows how difficult those activities that today we think, you know, they're just common.
Yes.
But for him, it was actually something really, really hard to go through.
Very difficult. Well, it is just an extraordinarily poignant reminder of George III, not just in his madness, but in his frailty. So thank you for showing me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
At the time when his father was in the grip of his madness, the Prince Regent was all too happy to see his father's mental state degenerate to make him unfit to rule, because he was ready to step in and take the throne.
King George III finally died on January the 29th, 1820, and the Prince Regent succeeded to the throne as George IV. By the time of his accession on the 19th of July that year, the king was not particularly liked by the public. He was obese, lazy, and quite possibly addicted to the opium-based drug laudanum. However, it wasn't all bad for George IV. He had a particular interest in architecture, and with the help of the architect John Nash, began a substantial building programme, shaping London and the royal residences the way he wanted them.
In 1825, George instructed Nash to begin a remodelling of Buckingham House, modifications that would turn it into the Buckingham Palace we know today.
His architectural legacy is still all around us in London today. If you think of places like Regent Street, one of the most famous streets in the whole of London, that was his doing with Nash. There's Regent's Park as well, there's Carlton Terrace, and most importantly, perhaps, somewhere that's so iconic of London, Buckingham Palace, and we have him to thank for that.
George did not set out to do something tremendous. He wanted to basically restyle and refashion the houses that he lived in. He wanted to create something architecturally fabulous. And as a result, he ended up kind of reshaping the landscape of what we think of as modern London. So his relationship with John Nash was really quite extraordinary.
Another fruit of his partnership with John Nash was the transformation of the Marine Pavilion into this spectacular Royal Pavilion. And what did George do with this incredible building? Well, he threw huge, lavish parties and banquets, and his appetite was the stuff of legend.
If you didn't know anything about George IV and you went to Brighton Pavilion, you would realise that something very different is going on here. It's a really gaudy, extravagant demonstration, I suppose, of George IV's personality.
The Prince Regent thought he had absolutely impeccable taste. He thought he was a connoisseur of the arts. And then he built Brighton Pavilion. There it was, you know, these domes, these ornate domes, the chinoiserie, the kind of Indian motifs. I mean, it was the height of vulgarity.
This is a place where lavish parties were had and gambling would happen, sometimes all through the night. And it was just a kind of scene of complete dissolution and total debauchery, and just full of society's rich, dissolute reprobates.
One, having you all here in my home, and I'm sure that I'm going to have you all.
George IV's love of parties and banquets didn't go unnoticed, and his gargantuan appetite was legendary. Ivan Day is a food historian who has agreed to show me just how much the Prince Regent ate at one infamous meal, at breakfast. We know this because it was recorded by none other than the Duke of Wellington. It seems that for all he'd seen and done, the Iron Duke still thought the king's gargantuan meals were worth noting down.
Rather than preparing one of his big set-piece grand dinners, I thought the best way to illustrate to you the scale of his eating habits that we'd just have a George IV breakfast. So just before he died, about 2 months, he was served a breakfast where this was the main dish.
Wow. That is magnificent.
Pies were treated at the table in a very, very different way to how they're eaten now. So, for instance, what they did was they would actually cut the lid off. This is called bordering the pie. Once that's bordered, with a bit of luck, I've got to tease it open like that.
Oh, look at that. It's coming up beautifully.
And I've somehow or other going to put it over there, out of the way.
Wow, that is a lot of meat in that pie.
But we're told in the recipe that we actually have to put a garniture of egg yolk.
This is a very substantial breakfast, isn't it? Eggs, bacon. It's sort of a deconstructed Great British fry-up in a pie, isn't it?
George IV was a professional glutton. He ate for England. The man had a gargantuan, insatiable appetite, and some of the banquets that he had at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton were mesmerising. He used to actually import celebrity chefs from all over Europe, like Antoine Carême, to cook these enormous jellies that were shaped like Egyptian temples and pyramids, and he would guzzle them, and there would be like so many different types of food, and it would all be laid out in front of him, and he would just pour the whole thing down his gullet. It was quite a disgusting spectacle. He became absolutely immense in his later years.
The Duke tells us that he had 2 pigeons on his plate and 2 beefsteaks.
And this was a typical breakfast, or was he going to town on this occasion?
Well, in his position, it was a typical breakfast.
I just find it extraordinary that all this is breakfast. OK, so you can imagine George here salivating, ready for the pièce de résistance.
I mean, there are no horns on that pie, but this is the other side of Desperate Dan, isn't it, really?
That is huge, isn't it? And he ate 2 of those. 2 pigeons. That's just a gargantuan quantity of meat for any time of the day, but breakfast?
By the end of his reign, I mean, this guy is enormous, and the Duke of Wellington turns up to have one of the last recorded meals with the king, with George IV. And in front of the king is this humongous pie with beef steaks, with pigeons in it. Next to it's a bottle of Moselle, champagne, brandy, port. The Duke of Wellington thinks, well, who else is coming to breakfast? But it's just George. And he basically demolishes this whole item all on his own into his big fat tummy.
Here at the famous Berry Brothers and Rudd in central London, there is a long-standing royal connection. The company still holds the seal, which allows it to deliver by royal appointment to the modern royal household. Today, they still display an extraordinary set of scales on which were recorded King George IV's weight. The facts and figures might even have been recorded in his own hand.
So, Simon, what on earth is this incredible contraption?
This is a set of scales, originally put in here in 1698 in order to weigh the bags of tea and coffee, which this shop originally sold, as sort of an early marketing exercise. One of my ancestors decided to put a seat on it and begin to weigh customers. So why don't we get you to sit down and...
Goodness, the moment of truth.
Be careful.
Here we go.
Here we go.
OK, so far so good.
OK.
So I'm sitting where the Georgian customers would have sat 300 years ago.
Yes, you are, on the very same seat.
So, of course, the most famous customer was the Prince Regent.
Yes, he was a very famous customer here, and we have pretty strong evidence that he was weighed here. He was very sensitive about his weight.
And, of course, it was lampooned in all the cartoons of the day as well.
Of course. So he would have been very sensitive about this. So it would make sense, if he was being weighed here, to be as secretive as he possibly could.
George IV used to go in there before and after he'd had lunch. He would be weighed and his weight would be recorded in a ledger book. But he also to gauge the impact of his lunch and of his dinner, and he ate for England. So there was quite a profound difference in these instances. And to this day, you can go in and see those weights recorded in this ledger book.
So here it is.
This is the famous ledger. I can't wait to see.
So, these are the 2 pages that are considered to be the weights of the Prince Regent.
And what gives you the clue that they are his?
Well, there are 2 main points. One is that it's in a completely different hand from the rest of the book, which is strange. The other point, which sounds odd, is that there isn't a name attached to it. All the other entries are cited to someone.
And could you tell me what this says about the Prince Regent, these different measurements? Was he in good shape?
He certainly wasn't in good shape. We can see that he was fluctuating around about 16 or 17 stone.
So he wasn't a tall man either, was he? So that's quite a weight. And can you just tell me about some of the comments in the margin here?
Well, often we're saying what he was wearing, not the detail of the fashion, but shoes, boots, and so on.
Because that has a bearing then on...
It has a bearing of the weight, and that might be a little bit of vanity coming through. If you're a little bit over the scales, you want to be assuring people that you've got a heavy pair of boots on. What's also important, and we know his health wasn't great at the time, is that we mentioned gout quite a few times. Shoes, gout, gout, after gout. We know he wasn't well, and that could have been a reference to his size, but also why he was that size.
That's another fairly convincing piece of evidence, isn't it, that this actually is the Prince Regent's record?
I think that's probably pretty true, yeah.
Towards the end of his life, George was in terrible physical condition. A bloated 20 stone, plagued by dropsy and gout, and, just like his father, almost blinded by cataracts. He clung on doggedly until the 26th of June 1830, when, now bedridden, he suddenly exclaimed, "Good God, what is this? This is death," and took his last breath. He was 67 years old, and he went to his grave unmourned and unloved by his people.
Right at the end of his life, I mean, George couldn't have cut a more dreadful figure. I mean, he is bloated in his abdomen, his chest. The accounts say that his face was emaciated, and he's bleeding, and he's unable to control his bowel movements. It's a pretty ignominious and, frankly, unmourned end.
I don't think anyone then or now misses George IV, but he has indelibly marked the country and a number of cities with his architectural and artistic visions.
I think you really have to take your hat off to George, because this is not a minor achievement. And this is something that's with us today, something that Londoners appreciate. This is part of the fabric of our landscape. This is something that people come to London to admire.
And that ended the Georgian era. George III and IV may only be 1 digit removed, but they could hardly have been more different. George III was a pious, devoted family man, and someone of quite simple tastes, if we exclude the odd extravagant bathing trip. As for his son, George IV, well, it's sometimes said that the British monarchy's greatest achievement was to survive despite George IV. And yes, it is rather tempting to think of him as just a debauched, decadent, selfish king who died the victim of his own excesses. But at the same time, he shaped so much of what the public face of the monarchy is today. His redesigns of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, and his delight in the sheer bling of royalty, rather than destroying the monarchy, set the stage for the pageantry and splendour that are their hallmark today. I'll see you next time. How did Charles II become more famous for his sexual adventures than for performing his royal duties? Who were the many mistresses who visited his bed? And why was one court official known as the Royal Pimp Master?
Charles II was an indulgent man. He was a debaucherous man. He restored the institution of the monarchy, and he brought a certain joie de vivre to society.
Here's a man who came along with bags of wit and charm, lots of colour, a bit too distracted by his mistresses and spaniels, but he brought back the grandeur to monarchy. He re-established monarchy in Britain.
He was incredibly charming, he was witty, he was erudite, and he was a very likeable person. However, he was not a very effective leader, necessarily.
If I had to pick three things that summed up Charles II, he was feckless, he was slothful, and he was lewd in his behaviour.
In this episode, I look at the Jacobean fashion for intimate wigs and condoms. I review the glorious clothes that Charles II actually wore. I taste some of the royal food and drink from the time. And I examine the secret tunnel that linked the Theatre Royal to a bedchamber across the road, which allowed a royal liaison with a certain Nell Gwyn.
I'm Tracy Borman, and in this episode, I'm going to take you behind the scenes to find out what really went on in the private life of King Charles II. It's May 1660. After 10 years in exile, Charles Stuart has been invited back to England from the Netherlands to reclaim his throne as King Charles II. Here in London, he receives an enthusiastic, even ecstatic welcome. It seems that people are glad to see the return of the monarchy after the dark and unhappy years of Cromwell's Commonwealth.
King, king!
In 1660, when Parliament invited Charles back, there was general euphoria. There had been a very buttoned-down Puritan regime, and people had had enough. Charles came back from the continent with a certain amount of glamour and a relaxed attitude. It went down very well.
People were desperate for a change. And Charles, as we know, really began to embody what the Restoration was all about. It was a little bit more laissez-faire, you know, it was bawdy, it was light-hearted. It was all of the things that people were deprived of during the Civil Wars.
Charles II is remembered as being the merry monarch who presided over this court of excess and libertinism, but actually, I think he was really successful in getting a handle of the zeitgeist of the time and navigating his way through some of the most devastating things that could affect any monarch: the Great Plague, the Great Fire of London, and a huge crisis over who would be his heir afterwards.
There was something about the new king that was certainly not in doubt, and that was his very healthy libido. It's said that during the course of his life, Charles fathered as many as 17 illegitimate children by up to 8 different mistresses.
Don Jordan is an expert on the comings and goings in the king's bed.
So, Don, when you think of royal sex lives, they're usually quite ritualistic, aren't they? There's a lot of ceremony involved. Was it like that for Charles?
I think Charles was the king who actually changed all of that. There was nothing ritualistic about it at all, except if there was any ritual, it was the endless pursuit of sex. He was a man who actually enjoyed women, he enjoyed the company, and he certainly enjoyed the sex, and he pursued every woman he could pursue, as long as they were good-looking.
Charles's libido was off the scale. Many monarchs had mistresses, but Charles took it to a whole new level. He had multiple mistresses at the same time and his wife, and he often had them working with and living with each other.
He felt his place in society, his power, his money, entitled him to have basically whatever he wanted. And this was no holds barred in terms of sex. So like every desire, every whim he had could be satisfied.
It was almost as though he wasn't married. Just the sheer kind of enthusiasm with which he threw himself into all these extramarital relationships. And his whole court was at it as well. It was a decadent court. And in some ways, this was a deliberate response to the drab, mournful, life-denying years of miserable Puritan rule, which had happened in the 1650s. So there was a political dimension to the hedonism as well.
Charles's legendary sexual appetite had to be sated by any number of other women. Of course, these liaisons had to be very carefully planned, which often meant someone at court helping out. But who? Step forward, William Chiffinch, royal page, keeper of the closet, otherwise known as the Royal Pimp Master. So, Dom, tell me about this guy, William Chiffinch.
Well, William Chiffinch was really the most important man in the palace, apart from the king, in terms of what actually happened in the palace. Because he looked after this backstairs area that we're in now. His job was to procure a secret world of enjoyment for the king. He was the man who brought the women for him. And these women were procured by Chiffinch into this area here that only he and the king had access to it. And then the other side of the palace, through the door here, on this side was the official palace. This was the external world that other people would see.
William Chiffinch was officially page of the backstairs, so a servant who would look after the king's more intimate needs, and he had apartments adjoining the king's apartments. What he was actually known as in the court was the Pimp Master General.
He not only looked after all the people who came and went, which made him a very important man, but as far as Charles was concerned, his main role was as the court pimp. He used to trawl the slums of London to find the young women to bring to court for Charles and his courtiers.
He procured prostitutes, procured upper-class courtesans for the king, anything the king wanted on the female stakes. He also had a discreet collection of pornography, which were described as the brave pictures, which the king and his friends would go to see in private.
What he also did was he kept a little network of friends and alliances within Whitehall, and he was often accused of being corrupt. Samuel Pepys speaks of going into the king's closet at the request of Chiffinch, and speaks about how he was eating pickled herring and drinking expensive wines. So Chiffinch was free with the king's food and wine, but also in charge of harvesting the very best mistresses and one-night stands for the king.
The most famous of all King Charles's mistresses, and the one of whom it's said that he never tired, was Nell Gwynn, who worked here at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. She certainly had all the attributes that appealed to the royal eye. She was pretty, witty, and the least greedy of all Charles's mistresses. A lot of her early life was spent in the London slum areas that once surrounded where I am now, modern-day Covent Garden.
Nell basically made a living selling oranges outside the theatre with her favourite trick was to put the tray just under her bosoms so that the orange sales would presumably be boosted as a result. She was spotted by some of the actors who she then had affairs with, and Charles, being a patron of the theatre, then spotted her himself, or maybe Chiffinch got her for him, and she became one of his favourites.
She gravitated towards the stage and eventually became an actress, and it was there in Covent Garden that she caught the king's eye, and he summoned her to his box, And on one occasion, he actually took her out for a meal. The king, the king's brother, James, they were both in disguise, and her. And at the end of it, they realized they didn't have any money, so she had to pay for these kind of 2 royal diners.
Nell Gwyn was just fun. You know, there were no airs and graces. She was just up for it. She enjoyed herself. There was no formality to this. And yeah, I mean, that was great. Why not?
Such was Charles's infatuation with Nell that he's said to have used a secret tunnel to meet her, but not one leading to the wing of a royal palace. No, far from it. This one leads from the Theatre Royal over here, under the road, and into this pub, now appropriately called the Nell of Old Drury. Its manager, Stephen, agreed to show me around.
Tracy, so if you'd just like to come through here, just turn this on.
I'm excited to see this.
So, this is the Nell of Old Drury's best-kept secret. Behind this door is where the tunnel is, where Charles II came.
Wow, look at that.
And if you look, you can see this is all here, the original arch.
And where would the tunnel have ended up?
The tunnel would have been just on the other side of the theatre, just past the ballet room on this side.
So Charles would have been in there watching a show of some description, maybe gets a bit bored, or it's during the interval, walks through the tunnel.
Yes, comes through the tunnel and then meets his mistress, Nell Gwyn.
Here, in the cellar? Or?
No, I would imagine it would have been in one of the bedrooms upstairs. This isn't exactly the most romantic setting.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So he's done the deed and then goes back, presumably...
Goes back over to watch the end of the performance.
Job done.
Job done, exactly.
When the king was at Drury Lane at the theatre, he would go and meet Nell Gwyn. And she was waiting for him in what is a pub across the road. And there was actually a secret tunnel underneath that linked the 2 buildings. And he would traverse that and go up and find her and have sex with her and then come back before the end of the play so he could applaud and be seen there and nobody would know what was going on.
I think Charles II's fascination for low-born women is something you see with a lot of monarchs because they've got that whole stifling environment in court. So Nell Gwyn, for him, it was a taste of real life and it was a bit of excitement and he could go and meet them out in the street. And the streets of London, you got to remember at that time, were pretty racy, filthy, degenerate, exactly the sort of thing a bored monarch was going to like.
Although Nell wasn't nearly as grasping as some of her rival mistresses, she did do quite well out of her relationship with the king. This is 79 Pall Mall, the site of her final London residence. It was originally a red brick townhouse. She moved here in 1671, and the freehold was conferred to her 5 years later. It was her main home for the rest of her short life. Nell died in 1687 at just 37 years of age, probably from the effects of syphilis. Not only had she won a special place in the heart of King Charles II, she had also carved out a niche in popular memory.
Nell was really a favourite of Charles's for a large part of her life and his life, and considering that she started from the bottom of the heap, she did phenomenally well socially, financially, by Charles.
There was an element of companionship, but if it had just been a sexual kind of wham-bam, thank you, ma'am, if I can put it like that, then I don't think he would have bought her a beautiful townhouse in Pall Mall or given her a generous pension in her final days.
But although Nell Gwyn was by far the most famous of all the king's mistresses, a lady who refused to be one was to unwittingly become similarly well known. She was Frances Stuart, Duchess of Richmond and Lennox, a famed beauty who apparently went against the trend and consistently defied Charles's advances, which must have driven the king even wilder with lust. The lovelorn Charles commissioned a portrait of Frances, complete with helmet and trident. And it was this image of the king's nearly mistress
that appeared on British coinage for more than 300 years.
Samuel Pepys, the diarist, says that she was one of the most beautiful women at court. I mean, absolutely stunning. So much so that Charles got her dressed up in a trident and a helmet, and she was actually the Britannia on the coins that was in circulation in Britain from the 1670s all the way through to the 1970s. She was Britannia on the coin.
Frances Stuart was first introduced to Charles when she was young, 14, and Charles was completely smitten with her. But she never let him get close to her. She was clever enough to realise that to maintain her influence, which she already had, she couldn't better her position by sleeping with the king. So she flirted with him for years.
The dark Puritan years of the Commonwealth really were a thing of the past, and certain parts of society readily embraced the new freedom. It was said that the court of King Charles was a reflection of how things were at the time, which may have been true, but even royal courts aren't immune to health risks, especially sexual health risks.
Charles obviously was in exile for years. I mean, what do you do when you're exiled for years in royal courts? You're basically having a good time, you're very bored, you're doing all the things that a bored, rich young person's going to do. The thing is, when he came into power as King Charles II, he carried on doing all the things that a bored person in exile were going to do. So he had all his mistresses, he did his gambling, he went to the theatre, he just carried on while this time being king.
They believed that you live life in the moment. Nobody expected to lead these long, sort of healthy lifestyles that we have, where everybody's very cautious about what they eat and how they conduct themselves in terms of health. In the 17th century, you didn't know if you could be dead tomorrow. So take your pleasure while you can. Pick your rosebuds while you may.
This is Soho, the heart of London's sex industry today. In Stuart times, prostitution was simply a fact of life in the capital, with just about anything available to suit any budget. With it came the problem of venereal disease. So prostitutes would probably have had to make use of one of the trade's more curious items, the merkin wig. And what's a merkin? Well, it's a wig that covers certain other parts of the anatomy.
Maybe it's not too surprising that diseases like syphilis were rife at court. The king even had his personal pox doctor. I'm here at a notorious members club in Soho to meet Dr. Rosemary Leonard and find out a little more about how sexual diseases were treated at the court of King Charles II.
So, Rosemary, we have quite an intriguing collection of items here, don't we? Can you talk me through some of it?
Yes, this is the state of the art for the apothecary in Jacobean times. There were things they could do to try and protect themselves from getting sexually transmitted diseases, and also, one presumes, to stop pregnancies. So, this is a Jacobean sort of protective, one might say, and this was tied on. I mean, you can't imagine it now. I mean, you think it would work as a contraceptive because they actually wouldn't want to do it anymore, but it was actually tied on to try and keep it in place.
I was going to say, otherwise, you'd imagine that would stay on for about 2 seconds.
No, I can't think it worked at all. I just think it came off.
Absolutely.
So perhaps that's what happened. So they then also had the larger, more robust version.
The deluxe version, here we go.
The deluxe version.
And what is this made out of? It's very thick.
It is very thick. It's made out of animal intestine. Sheep's intestine, cow's intestine. They would pull them on, tie them at the top and pull them on.
I hardly dare ask, but would it have been used only once?
Well, we don't really know, but I would presume an upper-class gentleman or the king would have a good supply, but people of lesser means, probably, yes, they would rinse them out, wash them and use them again.
I'm going to quickly hand this back to you so we can pass on.
One way you could protect yourself was to use a fairly new invention called a condom, or a condom as we would know it. And at this time, they were made largely from either sheep's gut or another type of animal intestine. and they could be washed out and reused again, or they were made out of a very fine linen cloth as well. Again, washed out and reused.
So what's next?
So, despite using contraceptives protection, pox was rife and they would get lesions on their skin. So they would try and treat them with a wonderful poultice of frog skin. You mixed it up with animal lard, that's animal fat. You made a poultice and rub it on to the poxy lesions. So even when the pox had healed, it would destroy the look of their pubic area. They'd have scarring, so they use these.
The famous merkin, the pubic wig, just to cover it all up.
Cover it all up. And also, having a lot of pubic hair was, unlike today, it was regarded as being very sexually attractive.
Really? Fashions have changed that much?
Fashions have changed, yes.
Now, would this have been real pubic hair?
Afraid so. Yes, it would have been. And they tied them on.
Right. One would imagine they might not have stayed in place throughout, but...
Yeah, you can imagine them going somewhere where they, yes, in the wrong position.
Women and prostitutes, and sometimes men as well, if they wanted to hide the symptoms of venereal disease, they'd wear a merkin, which is basically a pubic wig, and they wore them to hide these grotesque symptoms that they would have contracted.
Could be lice, could be symptoms of poor hygiene, but more likely it would be venereal disease. So they were hiding that away. So it would probably be made of hair, animal hair, maybe human hair, maybe their own hair. But it could also be soft cloth. I mean, it may have been decorative on occasion, it may have been jokey, but I think in the majority of cases, it was to hide something down below that wasn't quite right.
King Charles II had other loves, besides women, of course. Horse racing was one, and another was his dogs. The king was very fond of the spaniel breed, and it's said that he never went anywhere without at least 3 of them at his heels. The downside was the mess. Apparently, it was impossible to walk in a straight line across the floors of the king's residences. They were also great flea magnets, and it's said that people took them into their beds so that the fleas would bite the dog and not them.
He didn't discipline the dogs, so they would just foul everywhere. So the whole kind of these beautiful staircases and gilded rooms were just kind of iced in this kind of disgusting sort of dog excrements, and it was seen as sort of like symbolic of the kind of moral filth of the day.
Charles's main objective in life was to play things as carefully as he could. And sex and extravagant lifestyle and eating and all of this type of thing was this incredible distraction for him, which meant that he didn't have to think about the problems of the court, of the country. It was total escapism.
Another of Charles's great loves was food. Mealtimes were filled with ritual and ceremony. Food historian Ivan Day has agreed to meet me at the historic 15th century Long Crendon Manor in Buckinghamshire to talk me through and show me just what the king ate.
Tracy, I've got here a really remarkable bit of British history, which is a book published during the reign of Charles II about the history of the Order of the Garter. And during his reign, of course, King Charles II was the chief pixie of the Order of the Garter.
And there he is in all his splendour.
Why we're focused on it is a bit further back in the book is an account of a feast held at Windsor in 1671. And at that meal, we have the first record of ice cream being served. So...
Wow, look at that. That's amazing to see a meal in such detail like that.
Well, it's about as regal as you can get, isn't it? This is St. George's Hall.
There at the top table, I presume that's the man himself, that's Charles.
Now, he's sitting alone under a canopy of state, and all these people around him are serving him. The knights are all sitting here, and they're probably consuming the first course of the meal. And there were two main courses of the feast, and we also have the menu, or the bill of fare for that meal. You've got these savoury dishes, lobsters and things that could be cooked very quickly, game birds, and then afterwards, I guess they had what was the equivalent of our modern after-dinner chocolate, which was a dessert, but they called it the banquet.
So not a great feast, as the word conjures up.
No, it had a totally different meaning in those days. Probably the most luxurious item is one plate of ice cream.
Wow.
And that really is the first record of ice cream being
here.
served in Britain, yeah.
That's extraordinary.
Because Charles was a king, his table was always extremely well laid, and in the 17th century, that meant a multitude of different dishes put on the table all together. You know, he could have 20, 30 dishes laid before him of meats and pies and puddings and really sumptuous things. He didn't have to eat everything that was put before him.
He would sit there having little bits of this and little bits of that. Even the act of wasting food was something that only a king could do, because who else in society could waste that amount of food?
You'd need a Hollywood budget to do this authentically, but I've had a go at replicating Charles's dessert or banquet course.
Wow, all of this just for one man. That's extraordinary. So, Ivan, where do I start?
Well, I think you should try one of the oldest dishes of the banquet course, which is this very light thing called a wafer.
Lovely. It's beautifully decorated.
Made in 17th century wafering.
That's nice. It's not too sweet, but still a nice flavour. OK, and now this looks glorious.
Well, this is a syllabub in a 17th century syllabub glass, and you, first of all, drank the liquid from the bottom by sucking it through the spout. That's not like a teapot, it's not for pouring, it's for sucking. So here we go.
Huh. And it really works.
You get a strong alcoholic kick, and then you eat the rest of it as spoon meat.
Ah, so a little bit of cream to follow the booze.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What's on this very
Well, there's an
beautiful
array
plate here?
of white and red gingerbreads and black gingerbread. And then these are called pippin knots. They're made from apples. And then this one, which is the most dangerous food on the table, this is the Viagra of the Stuart period.
Oh, really?
It's candied oringo root, and it was considered to be the most powerful aphrodisiac, pretty suited to this particular merry monarch, I would have thought.
Well, now you've set it up, I've got to try this.
I'm stepping well back.
I can't account for my actions after this. That's very unusual. It's kind of like parsnip. I'm getting not what I was expecting at all.
Yeah, it's sometimes called sea parsnip. What you're eating it with is a thing called a sucket fork. So you can eat something sticky like that with the fork. And then why don't you try Charles's ice cream?
This is really the showstopper, isn't it? The ice cream. Okay, lovely. That is delicious. It's very delicately flavoured. What is that I'm tasting?
It's orange flower water, which was really the perfume of the court of Louis XIV.
Of course, yes, he loved orange flower, didn't he? Well, that's absolutely beautiful, very delicate flavour.
One of his favourite foods was something called egg and ambergris. And ambergris is basically waste matter that whales barf up or defecate, and it basically includes squid beaks and all sorts of horrible stuff, but it smells foul when it's found, but then acquires a very pungent odour. And Charles loved having this chopped up with egg. It was one of his favourite meals, and I have to say it sounds absolutely disgusting, but that's what he liked.
Why don't you try one of these? This is called Bane bread. We don't know why it's called that, but it's absolutely spectacularly delicious. Very crisp. Made from almonds.
Oh,
and
yeah.
You should get some rosewater in there.
Again, it's got a similar taste to the ice cream, that very fragrant.
They love the flavour of perfumes. It's extraordinary.
No, that's delicious. And here at the end, we have something healthy, a large dish of oranges.
And of course, you have to remember that his mistress, Nell Gwynn, was selling these in Covent Garden.
Ah, so this is a little reference to her, perhaps. How fantastic. Well,
Thank you for showing me all of this. I mean, I know you said this is a reduced version of one of Charles's banquets, but I just find it hard to believe all of this just for one man.
Not a man, a king.
And a very pampered one at that.
Yeah.
As well as his love of food, Charles was a bit of a dandy. He was fashion conscious and liked to look his best from head to toe. It's not that well known that he was the first to make the three-piece suit fashionable. Historical costumier Mark Griffin has agreed to show me what King Charles and other fashionable men and women in the mid-17th century were wearing. So, Mark, Your Majesty, looking resplendent already today. Can you talk me through what the King is wearing?
Hi, Tracy, yes. Well, right from the very start, he's got a new wonderful fashion item, the heeled shoes he's wearing. They're actually not made in a pair, they're straight-lasted, so he can wear them on either side. But he's got buckles on that he can interchange. They can have bows and things augmenting them. Then he's got his fine silk stockings on. I wouldn't suggest you feel them, but they are of the finest quality. Then we have, moving on to his breeches, which are made of velvet, probably from Italy, maybe Venetian, so very, very expensive. I mean, his breeches alone are worth more than most people will earn in their lifetime, so very, very expensive. Then he's wearing a shirt of finest Holland lawn linen. It is almost like silk. It's very, very fine indeed, and it's got some extremely fine lace on there as well.
So what do we have next in the repertoire?
Well, next is a new fashion that Charles has discovered in France. This is the waistcoat. He hasn't invented it, but he will popularise it. So we're actually getting the start of the three-piece suit.
Ah, it all starts here with Charles.
Charles loved clothing and he loved extravagance. And one of the things which he was said to have invented was the English waistcoat, which surprisingly was very plain, but he ornamented himself in other ways. It was very important that he be seen to be wearing these very sumptuous, luxurious things and fabrics because the clothes portrayed power.
This was all part of the theatre of the age. You know, he saw London as one sort of giant stage on which he must kind of appear and perform. And, you know, if he'd looked scruffy or if he hadn't cut a fine figure, then that would have blemished his power somewhat. So he was the first kind of dandyish king in many ways.
Well, now we come to the pièce de la résistance. This is the next thing I'm going to put on. Nice long coat, again in velvet, and we're starting to decorate with even more bows. There's silk here, there's ribbons, there's gold foil, there are little tiny metallic foil sequins, everything showing him off as the centre of power.
And imagine how it would have caught the light. You know, these palaces all candle-lit, there's lots of kind of gold thread, silver there. It must have just sparkled.
Men, during Charles's period at court, probably spent more time getting themselves ready than women, and they wore makeup, and they wore extremely luxuriant clothing. So Charles, for him, it was unacceptable to appear in court until he'd been made up to the nines, frankly, in all his laces, in all his silks, with his massive wig on. And that was the way the king had to appear. It would have been unacceptable for him to just simply lope in chinos and a pair of sneakers.
So, Mark, what sort of weaponry would the king have had?
Well, he's a man of action, a military man, but he does want something that's a bit more genteel. It's a gentleman's sword. This is a small sword, so it's got a lovely wire-bound hilt with lovely chiselled work on it, the height of Baroque fashion, basically. And he is going to need this because out and about, he may well be set upon by footpads, so he still needs to be able to fence, which was a very, very popular sport at the time. I mean, Charles had popularised the theatre, yacht racing, horse racing, but still fencing was a very, very popular exercise for men.
So he looks pretty much ready to me.
Yes, we have, if he's going out and about, we have this mantle, again, more velvet, the collar laced with a very fine bit of ribbon and some more lace.
Beautiful.
It does seem like, admittedly, this is the king, of course, so he's going to be splendidly dressed, but is it the case that men are the kind of peacocks at court and they outshine the women with all of these kind of layers and different fabrics?
Both sides are vying for looking as fine as possible. I mean, but looking at portraits and looking at the amount of work that goes into men's costumes, I think they're the ones spending the vast amount of money on their clothing.
So here he is in all his finery. He's got his brocade and the velvet cloak, the sword, all ready. He's set to go forth.
Other glimpses of the real King Charles were indebted to another famous name from the era, the diarist Samuel Pepys. It's sometimes forgotten that Charles's reign was blighted by two of British history's greatest disasters, the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666. Pepys recorded both in his famous diary, and it provides us with vivid pictures of a pretty terrible time, and especially Charles's direct and personal involvement.
The plague arrived in 1665. It killed 100,000 people in London, but anyone with any money, i.e. Charles, just got the hell out as quickly as possible. You know, the first signs of the plague, he left with his entire court. He actually abandoned the capital.
People in London knew this. They knew that the king had gone and all the aristocracy. And in fact, there were riots in London during the plague, and people who'd been locked up in their houses with the plague and the Red Cross put on were actually let out, which was against the law. But it was people were fed up with the knowledge that while they were dying in their thousands within the city walls, the king and all his court were carrying on as usual up in Hampton Court or in Oxford.
Thousands of people were dying every single day from the plague, and there was almost nothing that could be done apart from isolating those unlucky enough to catch it. Somewhere had to be found to bury the vast numbers of dead.
This is Bun Hill Row Cemetery in the City of London, which was designated as a burial ground for London's increasing number of plague victims. Bubonic plague was a terrible disease that slowly infected the body, covering victims with very painful sores and lesions, gradually draining them of life until they literally rotted away. The plague devastated the population of London.
All over the city, and particularly on its outskirts, as Bun Hill Row is, you've got these frightening lantern-framed pits where the bodies would accumulate, the dead cart would arrive, they'd shoot the bones into the pit. People used to run through the streets screaming and actually kissing people to try and spread the plague, and then they would dive into the bones before they were dead and just wait for death amongst those who were already dead.
There were hundreds of bodies put in there, and often very close to the ground surface, and there was no time to pour quicklime on the bodies or treat them in any way. And it was said at the time that a sweet, sickly smell hung over London because these bodies were everywhere, not far from the surface, rotting.
If the plague wasn't bad enough, Londoners had to endure a second great disaster in 1666. In September that year, a fire broke out at a small bakery in Pudding Lane.
At first, nobody seemed unduly alarmed. The Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, famously observed that a woman would be able to douse the flames naturally, so to speak. But the flames took hold, and soon the whole city was burning. Samuel Pepys watched the fire from right here, atop All Hallows by the Tower Church, next to the Tower of London. He wrote, 5th of September, 1666, I up to the top of Barking Steeple, and there saw the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw. Everywhere great fires, oil cellars and brimstone, and other things burning, the fire being spread as far as I could see it.
Samuel Pepys was the foremost diarist of the age. He leaves an incredibly vivid account of the Great Fire, and he used to climb up All Hallows by the Tower of London and watch just entire streets, buildings, palaces, monasteries just be devoured in one enormous flame. And without his eyewitness account, I'm not sure we'd have such a sort of sound sense of the scale and tragedy of that catastrophe.
As the fire got more out of control, King Charles and his brother James, Duke of York, travelled on horseback to join the fight against the flames. At the end of a long day, the two Royal Volunteer firemen were muddy and sweaty, their faces blackened with smoke.
Charles II really showed what he was made of in terms of being the people's monarch during the Fire of London, when he and the Duke of York went out to the fire directly and literally rolled up his sleeves and tried to help put the fire out.
He went down there, redeemed himself, stood there with Londoners, shared their suffering, came away covered in mud and blood after saving buildings.
If he hadn't got involved, the repercussions would have been huge. He was the leader of the country. He needed to be involved in fighting the Great Fire of London.
Bruce Hode is a former deputy fire chief who has co-written a book on the Great Fire of London.
So is this typical of a 17th century London street?
Well, absolutely typical, other than for the fact that this is built of stone and we'd have been looking at timber buildings then.
But close as that?
Absolutely, yes. Almost touching at the top, and from a firefighter's point of view, an absolute nightmare. Because as we are now, you can only see the length of the alleyway. You don't know what's happening behind you. The fire could be breaking out anywhere.
Yeah.
It would have been incredibly hot and smoky, extremely uncomfortable.
And in terms of casualties, what sort of numbers are we talking?
Well, surprisingly, there were only 6 deaths officially recorded and attributed to the fire.
So, in fact, word spread even quicker than the fire?
Yes, it did, and it gave people the opportunity to evacuate and get away from the flames before they were reached.
There were a number of ways to fight fire in the 17th century. So there were fire engines, but they're not fire engines that we would understand today. They were basically carts with huge buckets on the top that you could pump and water would squirt out. Never really enough to fully end a fire.
Charles, James, Pepys, Penn, they were all presented with a fire that was way beyond control at that time. And actually, through effective leadership, they did manage to bring the fire under control, but only when drastic action was taken, and they actually then started to blow houses up with dynamite. And that wouldn't have happened without some firm leadership on the part of Charles and his brother James.
King Charles was never one to put affairs of state before affairs of the heart. But he was actually very capable when he set his mind to business. Somehow, though, more pressing matters just seemed to get in the way, mainly in the shape of a woman. He was a popular, well-loved king who was genuinely mourned when, aged 54, he died a difficult death in 1685. Always a secret Catholic, he was returned to the faith on his deathbed. John Evelyn said of Charles that he was a prince of many great virtues and many great imperfections, but not bloody or cruel, which is probably a suitable epitaph and one he might well have chosen for himself. I'll see you next time. Henry VIII,
Probably the best-known English king in history. We're all familiar with the popular image of Henry, the ruthless, bad-tempered, overweight monster who had 6 wives, a spectacular falling out with the Pope in Rome, and an obsession with fathering a son and heir. And all of this is indeed true, but was there more to Henry than that?
Henry VIII started with a lot of promise, this kind of youthful, chivalric king. He centralised power in the country. He made the government fantastically wealthy, and most importantly, he prevented England from becoming Catholic.
He was this great, energetic youth. He had so much going for him, but throughout his life, he sustained knock after knock after knock. He'd risked so much in the pursuit of this male heir, and it had all really come to nothing.
Henry VIII's big problem was he comes to power and the dynasty still didn't feel as if it was legitimate. You know, and his big struggle to have a son is to make the dynasty legitimate. He has to go through 6 wives to get there, basically. I mean, in terms of himself, in terms of his personal life, he's a disaster.
He was monumentally self-obsessed and destructive, to the extent that his reign left nothing but division in the country. And his one goal, his one aim that motivated all of his murderous activities failed in itself, in that his dynasty lasted no longer than his children.
In this episode, we discover what made Henry VIII so popular during his early reign, delve into one of the king's favourite pastimes, real tennis, and explore the fashion that made Henry become one of the most iconic British monarchs. Why has history tended to forget about Henry's more handsome, youthful past? Were 6 wives really enough for him? Or was his love life also sprinkled with mistresses? And how would one simple accident lead to the creation of the tyrant we all remember today? I'm Tracy Borman, and this is The Private Life of King Henry VIII. It's the 7th of June, 1520, and although the weather was very different, nearly 10,000 Englishmen and Frenchmen meet in a field in northern Calais with their respective kings, Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France. In the past, this would have signalled yet another war, but this time they had an altogether different purpose. However, kings will be kings, and the old Anglo-French rivalry wasn't going to disappear overnight, although this time it took a rather different form. Cannons were swapped for quail's eggs, plate armour for plates of food, and hand-to-hand combat for cheek-to-cheek dancing, as each king attempted to outdo the other in a lavish battle of wealth.
The Field of the Cloth of Gold was this incredible moment in history where Henry VIII took a huge entourage, thousands of people across the Channel, over to France, and created this tent city / palace. There were glass windows in the tents, there were fountains of wine. The French did a similar thing. They had parties, they had feasts together. This was all to show solidarity with the French king.
This was Henry doing what Henry did best, putting on a show. He nearly bankrupted the English treasury in an effort to outdo Francis, with tents and clothing made from the eye-wateringly expensive cloth of gold. In fact, there was so much of the stuff that the site was named after it. However, all this opulence wasn't enough for Henry. He had to show his physical strength as well. So naturally, he challenged Francis to a wrestling match, the honour of their respective countries at stake. The French chronicles give rather more information about the outcome than the English ones. Henry lost.
So you have to imagine the field of the cloth of gold is supposed to be like, you know, what we'd have now as a leaders' summit. You know, it'd be terribly formal, you know, TV crews and very sensible meetings. But it wasn't like this in Tudor times. So you have basically King Francis I of France and Henry VIII wrestling each other and being terribly good chaps. And all around them, people are getting drunk out of these wine fountains. And then the backdrop to all of this is an artificially constructed palace, you know, that's supposed to look like the real thing, but it's basically a stage set for this event. And it's constructed at enormous cost. I mean, completely pointless, taken down and burnt afterwards, never used again.
Henry didn't really have a concept of the country and what it needed or what it thought. Henry and the country were the same in Henry's mind. They were Henry. That meant that, in effect, he had a country-sized ego. What was good for him, he thought was good for the country.
The whole thing costs hundreds of thousands of pounds. This is a man who had an enormous ego. He wanted to be seen as this young, youthful, chivalric prince. And I think it was all about chivalry. And although it seemed as though there was antagonism between Francis and Henry, in fact, it was a clever form of diplomacy as well, because they were showing that they were meeting each other on a level. They were both these kind of masculine forces. And perhaps it warded off a war which otherwise could have been much worse.
Did the 3-week extravagance achieve its aims of uniting England and France? Well, no. A couple of years later, they were at war again. So the field of the cloth of gold is destined to be remembered just as a massive show of one-upmanship. Although there is nothing left from the magnificent spectacle in France, Henry VIII also lavished money in a way that we can still see today. He was the most prolific builder of the Tudor period, and during his reign, the number of palaces increased from 12 to a staggering 55. These included St James's, Nonsuch, and perhaps the most famous of all, Hampton Court Palace. In actual fact, Hampton Court was not built by Henry, but by Thomas Wolsey, his closest advisor. But as he started to fall out of favour with the king, Wolsey wisely handed it over to him. Under Henry, Hampton Court became the most important palace of his reign. It was the place where Henry's only legitimate son was born, where he married his 6th and last wife, Catherine Parr, and it was said to be the king's favourite residence.
Hampton Court was just complete splendour and opulence, and it was all mod cons in the Tudor era. It was beautiful, it was beautifully furnished, the ivory and velvet furniture. The kitchens were magnificent. You could feed about 600 people. You had multiple ovens, fireplaces for spit roasting. There were cellars for wine and cellars for ale, and a room for spices. Spices that came from the Orient and Europe, which were essential in the preparation of food because you had to cover any sort of taste of things going off. So you've got this incredible advancement in Tudor technology.
Once Hampton Court Palace was his, Henry began a huge programme of expansion. He redecorated the Great Hall we're in now. And if you look up, you'll see a curious architectural detail. Henry had these carved wooden figures built into the eaves, and they're called eavesdroppers, which is where the word comes from. He wanted to discourage gossip and to demonstrate that everything said at court eventually reached his ears.
Henry started with amazing promise. This was the Renaissance. This was the age of humanism. This was a time when rulers like Henry in England had these glittering courts of intellectuals and artists, and they were exploring and discovering the world anew. And Henry was part of that. He was intellectual. He liked books, he liked learning, he was a great sportsman, he was a musician, he was an attractive, handsome man, he had great bearing. Henry had everything, and it was expected that his court would be the defining Renaissance court of Europe.
It was during the reign of Henry VIII that one of the most unusual jobs in history was created, the groom of the stool. The role entailed monitoring and assisting in the king's bowel movements. And this is a replica of Henry's toilet. So you'd think a job like this would have been given to the lowest of the low in society. Actually, it was quite the opposite. Grooms of the stool were most often the sons of noblemen and the gentry. It was the most intimate contact anyone had with the king outside the bedroom. And time with the royal derriere also meant time with the royal ear.
So the bodily functions of a medieval monarch, of a Tudor monarch, were something that was surprisingly open, and that includes going to the toilet, basically. And there was a kind of a prestige attached to being the aristocrat who was selected to basically clean up after Henry. So, you know, these aristocrats wanted to be down there getting down and dirty with Henry's backside.
Now, this might sound like it was the least desirable job in the whole of Tudor England, but in fact, the opposite was true, because that gave you, unrivaled, untrammeled access to the king, and you could influence him, when he was kind of at his most vulnerable. That was all part of the kind of mechanics of Tudor power. It was all about getting the king's ear. And factions formed, and usually the rival factions would try and recruit the current groom of the stool so that they could kind of, pour ideas like down the ear of Henry as he was sitting on his beautiful kind of velvet toilet.
But while Henry gave the impression that he was all-knowing, that didn't mean he wanted everyone knowing his business. After arriving at each palace, for instance, all he wanted was a little privacy. So after travelling to Hampton Court on a royal barge, he'd use a specially built watergate, complete with a covered walkway that led right to his private apartments. That way, no one could see the king come and go. This sense of privacy carried through to his relationships with women. An examination of Henry's sex life usually focuses on his endless quest for a son. And so we have a view of Henry as a faithful husband, albeit one who had an unfortunate habit of doing away with his wives when they no longer fulfilled his wishes. Actually, this wasn't necessarily the case. While other monarchs, such as Charles II and George IV, paraded their mistresses and flaunted them in front of their wives, Henry was different. He was actually an intensely private man, and so his extramarital liaisons were kept under wraps, known only to a small circle of loyal intimates.
Henry's relationship with women was really no different than the standard Tudor relationship between a man and his wife, or men and women. Women were just vessels for a man's seed. That was a woman's job. Produce a legitimate heir. That was it. And Henry looked at each woman and each wife as a potential for that. And that's it. There was no necessarily any great emotion in all of his relationships. He loved Anne Boleyn. He probably loved Jane Seymour as well. But how men and women related to one another was in a very different context than we imagine it today.
Tudor attitudes to love and sex were rather complex and contradictory. One view had it that sex was an incredibly healthy thing to do, provided it was good. Bad sex, however, was bad for the soul. Another view held that having sex shortened a man's life by a day so he should only do it to produce children, and certainly not for enjoyment. Henry tended towards the pro-sex point of view, and accounts suggest he was an affectionate lover, albeit rather a conservative one. Henry was a powerful king and rather handsome, a combination that made him pretty irresistible to women, at least in his younger days. This is Anne Hastings, the married younger sister of the Duke of Buckingham. Henry took her as his mistress in 1510, while his queen, Catherine of Aragon, was pregnant. She was the cause of the first argument in the royal marriage. Not that Henry really understood why. After all, he'd been free to indulge his passion for women during his youth. Why should he stop now he was married? This is Elizabeth Blount, known as Bessie, maid of honour to Catherine of Aragon. She gave birth to Henry's child in June 1519. We're not sure if Catherine knew about this, as Henry kept Bessie's pregnancy very secret indeed. The healthy boy, named Henry Fitzroy, was the only illegitimate child that Henry openly acknowledged. But there was a reason. It proved that the king was capable of fathering a son. The affair ended soon afterwards. Nobody is sure why, and Bessie was married off to the courtier Gilbert Talboys in 1522.
It's hard to underestimate Henry VIII's desire for a male heir. He was only the second of his dynasty. It was important to secure an heir for the future. And his desire for this male heir did have, implications on the women that he chose. And it was a driving force behind the break with the Church of Rome, behind the marriage to Anne Boleyn, and behind all the subsequent beheadings, divorces that came after that point. It was all in pursuit of this male heir.
Now we get to the Boleyns. Yes, that's Boleyns, plural. First up was Mary Boleyn. She gave birth to her first child in 1523, and it was almost certainly Henry's. This was made slightly worse by the fact that Henry had been the principal guest at Mary's wedding to his courtier William Carey only a few years before. But Henry lost interest in Mary once he'd got what he wanted. Keeping it in the family, next, of course, was Anne Boleyn, Mary's sister. Henry and Anne's relationship developed more gradually as Anne was determined to be more than just another of Henry's mistresses. So she teased him and led him on slowly. Henry's lust, and I think it's fair to say love, just got stronger and stronger. And well, the rest, as they say, is history. The severing of ties with Rome was followed by the severing of Anne's head from her shoulders.
Well, there's a rumour that Henry bedded not just Anne Boleyn, but her sister and her mother as well, which does sound far-fetched, but Henry could really, take his pick. He was the king and no one's going to say no to him.
The Boleyn family are massively ambitious and they will do anything to get in with the king. So Anne plays very hard to get. She plays a very clever game. She's arguably the wife that he loved the most because she was very intelligent and she had French manners. She'd spent time in the French court. But they are an ambitious family. The girls vie for his attention. Anne is the one who succeeds, but oh my goodness, how she must have wished she hadn't succeeded when she faced the execution block.
So Henry clearly found plenty of ways of filling his spare time, and as well as women, he found another, real tennis. This was the forerunner of tennis as we know it today, and Henry had a court built at Hampton Court Palace so he could play his favourite game. The first tennis court at Hampton Court was built for Cardinal Wolsey between 1526 and 1529. As a young man, Henry VIII was a keen and talented tennis player who spent hours on court. Leslie Ronaldson has agreed to show me the court where the king regularly played.
Wow, this is amazing. So we're standing on Henry VIII's court?
Yes.
Or almost.
Yes, he played on this site, yes.
That's incredible. I think, you know, I work at Hampton Court, but I've never been in here before, so this is such a treat.
That's actually sinful.
It is, it really is, but I'm so pleased now that I am. And so this wasn't Henry's, but it was the site of Henry's court. And he was hugely keen, wasn't he, on tennis?
Oh, massively. He would have played it as a child because Henry VII, his father, was an addict as well. And it was a way of showing off as well as keeping fit. And he obviously did many things to keep fit.
Well, we can see just from looking at this court, it's very different to lawn tennis, isn't it? It shares the same name, but real tennis, it looks altogether more complicated.
The modern game of lawn tennis, which some people call tennis, really shouldn't have been called tennis at all. It's similarities. There's a net and it scores in 15s. And this is a type of ball that Henry VIII would have played with. It's made of animal leather and stuffed with either human or animal hair.
It's quite a lot lighter and smaller, isn't it?
They varied in size a bit, depending on how they were sewn, because it was all hand-sewn, of course. But it actually bounces still, and if you take a Tudor-style racket, round-faced with strings, it does bounce quite a long way. It can bounce. You see, when you actually hit it, it bounces quite well off the strings.
Henry had interests in a number of fields. He was a very accomplished sportsman, dancer. He excelled in physical pursuits, and the physical pursuits of royalty. Horses, falconry, prowess. These were things that he achieved immensely well. And at the same time, he had a life of the mind.
He's a Renaissance man. He writes, he paints, he jousts, he hunts, he plays tennis. He's sporty. He writes books on religion. He's a great guy.
What I am interested in is Henry himself as a tennis player. So did people let him win, or was he actually pretty good?
He was very good. Even with the sycophants around him, he probably was world-class, and he performed a lot in front of people. The galleries that you see today around us are actually made because people wanted to watch.
So Henry's courtiers would have been lining the court here, up in the galleries. The ladies, presumably, would have been watching Henry?
Yes, and ambassadors. Lots of the court would have played against him. A lot of players, actually, he played with, he lost a lot of money to, and they lost money to him because you could play off handicap as well.
So they always gambled on the outcome?
Always gambled. It was very much a gambling game, and, of course, Anne Boleyn was watching a game of tennis when she was taken to the council and then arrested.
Oh, really?
She complained that she hadn't won her bet.
She had her priorities right.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that Henry's putting on a bit of a show.
Absolutely. It's extraordinary that so many ambassadors can report on his tennis even though they weren't playing themselves. Obviously, a lot of people were watching, although he used it for energy and athleticism as well. He was a great athlete.
But it's far more than just a game to Henry, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A, money, and B, to show off that he could win and beat these other guys.
Sadly, the athletic, handsome, even-tempered Henry was about to have his life turned upside down by an event that helped transform him into the monarch we all recognise today. On the 24th of January, 1536, when Henry was aged 44, an accident occurred during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. Henry was thrown from his horse, which then landed on top of him. One report claimed he was unconscious for 2 hours, and it was feared his injuries would prove fatal. The king did, of course, recover, but the accident caused serious leg problems which plagued him for the rest of his life. the fact that he was in constant, often acute pain brought about profound changes in his personality. Henry was becoming the brutal, cruel, paranoid man that he is remembered as today.
One thing that comes out of that accident is this horrendous injury on his leg, which becomes ulcerated, it's an open gash, and there's all sorts of barking mad medical treatments about draining the humours and sticking red-hot pokers in it.
It's supposed that they were exacerbated by the tight garters he wore around his leg, which may have cut off circulation. We don't actually know what it was that caused these leg ulcers, but they seem to be incurable, and they festered, and you could smell this from rooms away, which was absolutely nauseating, as you can imagine.
One of the ways in which we can clearly see how Henry changed over his lifetime is in the clothes he wore. Style definitely gave way to comfort as Henry's waistline expanded and infirmity set in. Larry Lynn knows all about Henry's dress sense and has agreed to take me through what he would have worn in his later years.
So Tracy, this is Rich, who is going to be our King Henry for the day, and this is Joe, who is King Henry's dresser, which is sort of wrong for King Henry because, of course, he would have had all men to dress him. So the room would have been absolutely full of gentlemen ready and eager to dress the king.
Would his dressers have been under pressure to get a move on, given the king's so uncomfortable standing?
I imagine so. We know that he was in a considerable amount of pain, and we know that his leg was not in a good state a lot of the time. So I imagine it must have been quite difficult to dress him, and we know that he got quite bad-tempered.
The evidence suggests that there was a shift in the way that his personality was working after the jousting accident. He seems to become moodier, he seems to have a shorter temper, he seems to not tolerate as much as he had done before. And of course we know the famous stories about Henry VIII and his wives. This all happens on the other side of that weird hinge in the middle of his life, which was the jousting accident.
So, he's already pretty well dressed. Can you talk me through what he's wearing now?
Sure, he's in his sort of basic state of dress now. You can see he's got his linen undershirt, which is sort of his basic garment of underwear, which is regularly washed, and it's keeping him clean and smelling fresh. It's decorated as well, so you can see that's a sort of sign, a status symbol, because it's decorated in fine silks. And then he's also wearing his doublet and hose. It's woven in a cloth of gold, which by sumptuary law is reserved only for the immediate members of the royal family. So as soon as you see this, you know you're looking at the king. And of course, we can't not mention the Henrician codpiece. And so it was a very fashionable item in the 16th century, but for Henry, probably more so than at most other royal courts, because he really had something to prove, because he didn't have a son for the majority of his reign, and then when he did, only one, and so he was really at pains to show his virility and his masculinity.
As Henry's leg really immobilized him, he started to put on enormous girth, which exacerbated the leg even further. And he became so awkward and disgusting and difficult to maneuver that there needed to be several people who helped him do anything that he wanted to do.
So now we need this chain with the H on it. So Henry did like to promote his own name at court. At Hampton Court, we know there are lots of H's, and then also the letters of his various wives decorating the building. But here we have the H chain and also the symbol of the Order of the Garter.
The highest military order in the land.
Absolutely. So he is projecting himself as a warrior and a member of that class.
Well, I mean, he's looking pretty much ready, but that's not quite it, is it?
It's not quite it. The court is cold. He's still got a bit more showing off to do. So the next layer is the gown itself, which is what added so much bulk to the sort of final finished look. And here you can see it's trimmed with a lot of fur, in this case sable, which was reserved for the upper echelons of the aristocracy.
Henry was an immensely tall man. He was physically imposing. He was 6'2", which in the age with the diets that people had then was head and shoulders above most people. But by the end of his life, his dissolute life, he also weighed around 28 stone.
If you're a king or a queen, then there's always going to be the option to gorge yourself on food. Now, you don't have to take up that opportunity, but that was only after his accident when he could no longer really take exercise, his metabolism was slowing down, and also his whole psychology had changed by that point. You know, he was an angry man, and this was a perfect storm, which meant that instead of picking, he'd actually pick up the whole kind of tray of food and pour the whole thing into his mouth and just eat. It became something of an addiction, which is why he became morbidly obese, just like George IV did, and kind of in a similar way to Queen Victoria as well, who put on a lot of weight in her later years.
So now presumably it's time for the hat.
Absolutely. So the one of the final pieces of the puzzle is the hat.
And this immediately creates that iconic image that's so familiar from all the portraits of Henry.
Absolutely, and he wouldn't be seen sort of in public around the court without a hat. So yes, now we have the sort of iconic Holbein look.
So Henry's all set, he's looking splendid, presumably dressed now for some great occasion.
Absolutely. This is definitely for on show at court.
It's money well spent. Thanks, Hilary. In October 1537, Henry's third queen, Jane Seymour, died of postnatal complications a couple of weeks after giving birth to Henry's only legitimate son, Edward. So Henry was back on the market again. Spotting an opportunity, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, played matchmaker. He proposed a political marriage between Henry and Anne, the daughter of the Duke of Cleves. In an age before selfies, finding out what someone looked like before meeting them was far more difficult. So Henry dispatched his court painter, Hans Holbein, to paint Anne's portrait. And this is what Holbein came back with. Henry was delighted with the result, and the match was confirmed with a treaty signed on the 4th of October, 1539. Anne arrived in England on New Year's Eve, and in true chivalric tradition, Henry, in disguise, hastened to meet her. Unfortunately, Henry was appalled by what greeted him. This was the Tudor equivalent of a first date with someone you've met online, only to find out that they don't exactly look like their photo. Henry shouted at Cromwell, "I like her not."
Anne of Cleves is often the skipped-over wife, you know, because Henry basically has a very nice portrait sent of her by Holbein, and he feels that he's pressured into marrying her. She turns up, he sees her in the flesh and goes, "Oh my God, that's not what I was expecting, that's not what I ordered." But that picture of, you know, the Flanders mare, the ugly woman who Henry spurns before he goes on to his next wife, that's all being challenged now.
When Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves met, initially, he was in disguise because he wanted to see what she thought of him, and she wasn't impressed with what she saw. And so he was obviously, you know, had his feelings hurt and decided that he didn't like her either. So this is a myth that Anne of Cleves was unattractive and unappealing to Henry as a wife.
But where today we might send a text afterwards to say, "Thanks, but no thanks," it wasn't so simple for Henry. It would have caused a major diplomatic incident if he'd reneged on the treaty, and England could not afford to lose allies. So, very begrudgingly, Henry married Anne 6 days later. Of course, after the wedding comes the wedding night, and here too Henry had difficulties. When he ran his hands along his new wife's body, he's said to have been so repelled that he could do no more. He said to Cromwell, "She is nothing fair and has very evil smells about her." Apparently, he could never be stirred to know her carnally, and so left her as good a maid as I found her. The marriage was annulled in June. So that was that, and Henry married the infinitely more desirable Catherine Howard and got out of his marriage to the unbecoming Anne of Cleves. But was that really the whole truth? I actually think history has been rather unkind to poor Anne. In fact, I'd go further. I'd say she could justifiably claim to be the most successful of all Henry's wives. For a start, Henry was the only person to have called her ugly. There are no other disparaging accounts about her appearance. And as for Henry's inability to consummate the marriage, well, perhaps it was his fault and not hers. He was twice his bride's age and had become increasingly immobile in recent years. Rumours of his impotence had persisted for years, and an account of the wedding night proves that he was unable to stir up lust. Besides, Henry had already fallen in love with Catherine Howard by the spring of 1540 and was keen to get rid of Anne, inventing all sorts of reasons why the marriage couldn't stand. Anne of Cleves, fearing the same fate as her namesake, Anne Boleyn, complied and was rewarded with a string of properties, Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, to name just two. She managed to dodge the axe and outlived all of Henry's other wives.
By this stage, Henry is ailing. He's got this gaping wound in his leg. He's nowhere near as virile as he once was. He was impotent. He couldn't have sex with her. So in order to protect his kind of manly status, the story was put out by his courtiers that she was too ugly for him to bear the sight of. She was a Flanders mare, as he put it. And that was expedient for both of them. Like, she got out of the marriage and he didn't have to suffer that indignity any longer.
Actually, Anne of Cleves probably got the best deal out of all of his wives because she managed to detach herself from Henry VIII at a time when he probably wouldn't have been the best husband to be around anyway, and she lived a fine life. He thought of her and referred to her as being like his sister, and Henry then went on to marry his subsequent wives. So she was probably a lot more intelligent and canny than we've given her credit for.
Anne of Cleves was clearly a very intelligent woman, and in fact, maybe a very good-looking woman. And indeed, Henry might have actually got on quite well with her. There is the suggestion that actually Henry's underlying problem was impotence, that he moved on from her because he simply, as with his other wives, he stopped performing very well in the bedroom. Whatever his feelings, I mean, she is allowed to retire. She's referred to as his sister. She has very good relationships with the children. You know, she's a wife, actually, who he seems to like having around even after he divorces her. So clearly everything wasn't quite as bad as poor old Anne of Cleves has been depicted.
Whether or not Anne was the Flanders mare history paints her as, it certainly seems that Henry liked her enough not to chop off her head. And since his accident, he was going through wives at an incredible pace.
I mean, it's very telling if you look at the timeline from the jousting accident, where he clearly not only injures his leg, but he injures his head as well. It probably affected his ability to perform in bed. It certainly seems to have impacted his memory. I mean, his last wife, he sentences to be put on trial for treason. Then when the soldiers turn up, he can't remember that he did that. He can't remember people who've been executed. He's got appalling temper tantrums. So he becomes a very different person. He becomes cantankerous, unbearable, very volatile, and most importantly of all, he goes through 5 wives after this jousting accident. I mean, Anne Boleyn is executed 6 months later.
I think Henry's been misrepresented in some ways. He wasn't a serial wife hater. He was married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years, and it was fine. It's only when she can't bear him a male heir, that's the main concern, that's paramount in his mind. And when that's not happening, that's when he begins to look to divorce them. You know, he only kills 2 out of 6 wives. And of course, he's not thinking straight by that point because he's got this horrific leg injury, and he's much more manipulable by that stage than he had been as a young man.
Towards the end of his life, the king had endured many years of agonising pain from the festering sore on his leg. It was a constant reminder of his lost youth and served to make him a bitter and angry monarch. Henry had become less mobile, tremendously overweight, and was so infirm that even walking upstairs had become too much for him. So he had a stair lift made to haul the royal body between floors.
Towards the end of his life, Henry cut a very pathetic figure. He was massive. He was sorry for himself. He was the victim in his own eyes of all these things. It was terribly sad he'd had to execute these women, but that was their fault, not his. And yet he was still incredibly proud. He still wanted to project this image of being the man that he wasn't. That amazing Henry ego meant that he wasn't going to let anyone know about or see the fact that he couldn't walk up the stairs.
He was monstrously obese. So what he had was this chair hoist, which he used to use at Hampton Palace. And he would be hoist down from the first floor to the ground floor and then pushed along in this glorified trolley or litter. But no one was allowed to see that. You know, when he actually met dignitaries, he met important ambassadors, he was always sitting on his grand throne. So this all took place behind the scene, because the whole point of being a monarch was you were meant to project an image of potency and power, and that was directly linked to the physical body of the king.
The trouble with Henry, and the reason I think he ends up as a very bitter old man and very bitter on his deathbed, he basically betrays everybody who loved him or respected him. I mean, you can include the Pope. Pope Leo actually bestowed an honour on him, Defender of the Faith, for his defence of Catholicism. Then he betrays the Catholic Church. You know, the wives who loved him, Catherine of Aragon, a faithful wife, divorced. Anne Boleyn loves him, executed. You know, Thomas Cromwell, faithful servant, executed. By the end of his life, you know, nobody wants to be Henry's friend, because you know what happens to Henry's friends.
The image of Henry VIII is one that's almost laughable. You know, it's the big fat man eating the turkey. And the reality was, to a certain degree, something apart from that. You know, he was not comical. He was a tyrant. He was an unreasonable man who executed hundreds of people during his reign, who was ruthless, who was not a good leader, but he started out with a lot of promise and a lot of potential, but he ultimately was destroyed by his own ego.
Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547, aged 55, forever to be remembered as an obese, cruel tyrant. The young, handsome Henry was long forgotten. So Henry's private life was much more interesting than his public one. It's actually by looking behind the scenes that we get a real glimpse of Henry the man, not just Henry the king. But then it's the same story with so many kings and queens. It's what makes the private lives of monarchs so fascinating.